The Gingerbread Man by Sarah Cohn Bryant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carolyn Francis. Once upon a time there was a little old woman and a little old man, and they lived all alone in a little old house. They hadn't any little girls or any little boys at all. So one day the little old woman made a boy out of gingerbread. She made him a chocolate jacket and put cinnamon seeds in it for buttons. His eyes were made of fine fat currants. His mouth was made of rose-colored sugar, and he had a gay little cap of orange sugar candy. When the little old woman had rolled him out and dressed him up and pinched his gingerbread shoes into shape, she put him in a pan. Then she put the pan in the oven and shut the door, and she thought, "Now I shall have a little boy of my own." When it was time for the gingerbread boy to be done, she opened the oven door and pulled out the pan. Out jumped the little gingerbread boy onto the floor, and away he ran, out of the door and down the street. The little old woman and the little old man ran after him as fast as they could, but he just laughed and shouted, "Run, run as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man!" And they couldn't catch him. The little gingerbread boy ran on until he came to a cow by the roadside. "Stop, little gingerbread boy," said the cow. "I want to eat you." The little gingerbread boy laughed and said, "I have run away from a little old woman and a little old man, and I can run away from you, I can." And as the cow chased him, he looked over his shoulder and cried, "Run, run as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." And the cow couldn't catch him. The little gingerbread boy ran on till he came to a horse in the pasture. "Please stop, little gingerbread boy," said the horse. "You look very good to eat." But the little gingerbread boy laughed out loud. "Oh ho, he said. "I have run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, and I can run away from you, I can." And as the horse chased him, he looked over his shoulder and cried, "Run, run as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." And the horse couldn't catch him. By and by the little gingerbread boy came to a barn full of threshers. When the threshers smelled the gingerbread boy, they tried to pick him up and said, "Don't run so fast, little gingerbread boy. You look very good to eat." But the little gingerbread boy ran harder than ever, and as he ran he cried out, "I have run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, and I can run away from you, I can." And when he found that he was ahead of the threshers, he turned and shouted back at them, "Run, run as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." And the threshers couldn't catch him. Then the little gingerbread boy ran faster than ever. He ran and ran until he came to a field full of mowers. When the mowers saw how fine he looked, they ran after him, calling out, wait a bit, little gingerbread boy, we wish to eat you." But the little gingerbread boy laughed harder than ever, and ran like the wind. Oh ho, he said. "I have run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, a barn full of threshers, and I can run away from you, I can." And when he found that he was ahead of the mowers, he turned and shouted back at them, "Run, run as fast as you can! You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." And the mowers couldn't catch him. By this time the little gingerbread boy was so proud that he didn't think anybody could catch him. Pretty soon he saw a fox coming across a field. The fox looked at him and began to run, but the little gingerbread boy shouted across to him, "You can't catch me." The fox began to run faster, and the little gingerbread boy ran faster, and as he ran he chuckled, I have run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, a barn full of threshers, a field of mowers, and I can run away from you, I can. Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man." "Why," said the fox, "I would not catch you if I could. I would not think of disturbing you." Just then the little gingerbread boy came to a river. He could not swim across, and he wanted to keep running away from the cow and the horse and the people. "Jump on my tail, and I will take you across," said the fox. So the little gingerbread boy jumped on the fox's tail, and the fox swam into the river. When he was a little way from shore, he turned his head and said, "You are too heavy on my tail, little gingerbread boy. I fear I shall let you get wet. Jump on my back." The little gingerbread boy jumped on his back. A little further out, the fox said, "I am afraid the water will cover you there. Jump on my shoulder." The little gingerbread boy jumped on his shoulder. In the middle of the stream, the fox said, "Oh dear! Little gingerbread boy, my shoulder is sinking. Jump on my nose, and I can hold you out of water." So the little gingerbread boy jumped on his nose. The minute the fox got on shore, he threw back his head and gave a snap. "Dear me!" said the little gingerbread boy. "I am a quarter gone." The next minute he said, "Why, I am half gone." The next minute he said, "My goodness gracious, I am 3/4 gone." And after that, the little gingerbread boy never said anything more at all. End of The Gingerbread Man by Sarah Cohn Bryant.
Chapter 11 of The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 11 of The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain. Getting Used to It. Read for you by Anna Blackwell, Santa Ana, California, November 2007. Chapter 11. We are getting foreignized rapidly and with facility. We are getting reconciled to halls and bedchambers with unhomelike stone floors and no carpets, floors that ring to the tread of one's heels with a sharpness that is death to sentimental musing. We are getting used to tidy, noiseless waiters who glide hither and thither and hover about your back and your elbows like butterflies, quick to comprehend orders, quick to fill them, thankful for a gratuity without regard to the amount, and always polite, never otherwise than polite. That is the strangest curiosity yet, a really polite hotel waiter who isn't an idiot. We are getting used to driving right into the central court of the hotel, in the midst of a fragrant circle of vines and flowers, and in the midst also of parties of gentlemen, sitting quietly reading the paper and smoking. We are getting used to ice frozen by artificial process in ordinary bottles, the only kind of ice they have here. We are getting used to all these things, but we are not getting used to carrying our own soap. We are sufficiently civilized to carry our own combs and toothbrushes, but this thing of having to ring for soap every time we wash is new to us and not pleasant at all. We think of it just after we get our heads and faces thoroughly wet, or just when we think we have been in the bathtub long enough, and then, of course, an annoying delay follows. The Marseillaises make Marseillaise hymns, and Marseille vest, and Marseille soap for all the world, but they never sing their hymns or wear their vests or wash with their soap themselves. We have learned to go through the lingering routine of the table d'hôte with patience, with serenity, with satisfaction. We take soup, then wait a few minutes for the fish, a few minutes more, and the plates are changed, and the roast beef comes. Another change, and we take peas. Change again, and take lentils. Change, and take snail patties. I prefer grasshoppers. Change, and take roast chicken and salad, then strawberry pie and ice cream, then green figs, pears, oranges, green almonds, etc. Finally, coffee. Wine with every course, of course, being in France. With such a cargo on board, digestion is a slow process, and we must sit long in the cool chambers and smoke and read French newspapers, which have a strange fashion of telling a perfectly straight story till you get to the nub of it, and then a word drops in that no man can translate, and that story is ruined. An embankment fell on some Frenchmen yesterday, and the papers are full of it today. But whether those sufferers were killed, or crippled, or bruised, or only scared, is more than I can possibly make out, and yet I would just give anything to know. We were troubled a little at dinner today by the conduct of an American, who talked very loudly and coarsely, and laughed boisterously, where all others were so quiet and well behaved. He ordered wine with a royal flourish, and said, "I never dine without wine, sir," which was a pitiful falsehood, and looked around upon the company to bask in the admiration he expected to find in their faces. All these airs in a land where they would as soon expect to leave the soup out of the bill of fare as the wine. In a land where wine is nearly as common among all ranks as water, this fellow said, "I am a free-born sovereign, sir, an American, sir, and I want everybody to know it." He did not mention that he was a lineal descendant of Balaam's ass, but everybody knew that without his telling it. We have driven in the Prado, that superb avenue bordered with patrician mansions and noble shade trees, and have visited the Chateau Borély and its curious museum. They showed us a miniature cemetery there, a copy of the first graveyard that ever was in Marseille, no doubt. The delicate little skeletons were lying in broken vaults, and had their household gods and kitchen utensils with them. The origin of this cemetery was dug up in the principal street of the city a few years ago. It had remained there, only 12 feet underground, for a matter of 2,500 years or thereabouts. Romulus was here before he built Rome. Thought something of founding a city on the spot, but gave up the idea. He may have been personally acquainted with some of these Phoenicians whose skeletons we have been examining. In the great zoological gardens we found specimens of all the animals the world produces, I think, including a dromedary, a monkey ornamented with tufts of brilliant blue and carmine hair, a very gorgeous monkey he was, a hippopotamus from the Nile, and a sort of tall, long-legged bird with a beak like a powder-horn, and close-fitting wings like the tails of a dress-coat. This fellow stood up with his eyes shut and his shoulders stooped forward a little, and looked as if he had his hands under his coat-tails. Such tranquil stupidity, such supernatural gravity, such self-righteousness, and such ineffable self-complacency as were in the countenance and attitude of that grey-bodied, dark-winged, bald-headed, and preposterously uncomely bird. He was so ungainly, so pimply about the head, so scaly about the legs, yet so serene, so unspeakably satisfied. He was the most comical-looking creature that can be imagined. It was good to hear Dan and the doctor laugh. Such natural and such enjoyable laughter had not been heard among our excursionists since our ship sailed away from America. This bird was a godsend to us, and I should be an ingrate if I forgot to make honorable mention of him in these pages. Ours was a pleasure excursion, therefore we stayed with that bird an hour and made the most of him. We stirred him up occasionally, but he only unclosed an eye and slowly closed it again, abating no jot of his stately piety of demeanor, or his tremendous seriousness. He only seemed to say, "Defile not heaven's anointed with unsanctified hands." We did not know his name, and so we called him the Pilgrim. Dan said, "All he wants now is a Plymouth collection." The boon companion of the colossal elephant was a common cat. This cat had a fashion of climbing up the elephant's hind legs and roosting on his back. She would sit up there with her paws curved under her breast and sleep in the sun half the afternoon. It used to annoy the elephant at first, and he would reach up and take her down, would go aft, and climb up again. She persisted until she finally conquered the elephant's prejudices, and now they are inseparable friends. The cat plays about her comrade's forefeet or his trunk often, until dogs approach, and then she goes aloft out of danger. The elephant has annihilated several dogs lately that pressed his companion too closely. We hired a sailboat and a guide, and made an excursion to one of the small islands in the harbor to visit the Castle d'If. This ancient fortress has a melancholy history. It has been used as a prison for political offenders for 200 or 300 years, and its dungeon walls are scarred with the rudely carved names of many and many a captive who fretted his life away here, and left no record of himself but these sad epitaphs wrought with his own hands. How thick the names were! And their long-departed owners seemed to throng the gloomy cells and corridors with their phantom shapes. We loitered through dungeon after dungeon, away down into the living rock below the level of the sea, it seemed. Names everywhere, some plebeian, some noble, some even princely. Plebeian, prince, and noble had one solicitude in common: they would not be forgotten. They could suffer solitude, inactivity, and the horrors of a silence that no sound ever disturbed, but they could not bear the thought of being utterly forgotten by the world. Hence the carved names. In one cell where a little light penetrated, a man had lived 27 years without seeing the face of a human being, lived in filth and wretchedness, with no companionship but his own thoughts, and they were sorrowful enough and hopeless enough, no doubt. Whatever his jailers considered that he needed was conveyed to his cell by night through a wicket. This man carved the walls of his prison house from floor to roof with all manner of figures of men and animals grouped in intricate designs. He had toiled there year after year at his self-appointed task, while infants grew to boyhood, to vigorous youth, idled through school and college, acquired a profession, claimed man's mature estate, married, and looked back to infancy as to a thing of some vague, ancient time almost. But who shall tell how many ages it seemed to this prisoner? With the one time flew sometimes, with the other never. It crawled always. To the one, night spent dancing had seemed made of minutes instead of hours. To the other, those self-same nights had been like all other nights of dungeon life, and seemed made of slow, dragging weeks instead of hours and minutes. One prisoner of 15 years had scratched verses upon his walls, in brief prose sentences, brief but full of pathos. These spoke not of himself in his hard estate, but only of the shrine where his spirit fled the prison to worship, of home and the idols that were templed there. He never lived to see them. The walls of these dungeons are as thick as some bedchambers at home are wide, 15 feet. We saw the damp, dismal cells in which 2 of Dumas' heroes passed their confinement, heroes of Monte Cristo. It was here that the brave abbé wrote a book with his own blood, with a pen made of a piece of iron hoop, by the light of a lamp made out of shreds of cloth, soaked in grease obtained from his food, and then dug through the thick wall with some trifling instrument, which he wrought himself out of a stray piece of iron or table cutlery, and freed Dantes from his chains. It was a pity that so many weeks of dreary labor should have come to naught at last. They showed us the noisome cell where the celebrated Iron Mask, that ill-starred brother of a hard-hearted king of France, was confined for a season before he was sent to hide the strange mystery of his life from the curious in the dungeons of Sainte Marguerite. The place had a far greater interest for us than it could have if we had known beyond all question who the Iron Mask was, and what his history had been, and why this most unusual punishment had been meted out to him. Mystery! That was the charm. That speechless tongue, those prison features, that heart so freighted with unspoken troubles, and that breast so oppressed with its piteous secret had been here. These dank walls had known the man whose dolorous story is a sealed book forever. There was fascination in the spot. That was Chapter 11 of The Innocents Abroad, Getting Used to It, by Mark Twain. Read for you by Anna Blackwell, Santa Ana, California, November 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. Unless one is wealthy, there is no use in being a charming fellow. Romance is the privilege of the rich, not the profession of the unemployed. The poor should be practical and prosaic. It is better to have a permanent income than to be fascinating. These are the great truths of modern life which Huey Erskine never realized, poor Huey. Intellectually, we must admit he was not of much importance. He never said a brilliant or even an ill-natured thing in his life. But then he was wonderfully good-looking, with his crisp brown hair, his clear-cut profile, and his gray eyes. He was popular with men, as he was with women, and he had every accomplishment except that of making money. His father had bequeathed him his cavalry sword and a history of the Peninsular War in 15 volumes. Huey hung the first over his looking-glass, put the second on a shelf between Ruff's Guide and Bailey's Magazine, and lived on $200 a year that an old aunt allowed him. He had tried everything. He had gone on the stock exchange for 6 months, but what was a butterfly to do among bulls and bears? He had been a tea merchant for a little longer, but had soon tired of Pekoe and Souchong. Then he had tried selling dry sherry. That did not answer. The sherry was a little too dry. Ultimately he became nothing, a delightful, ineffectual young man with a perfect profile and no profession. To make matters worse, he was in love. The girl he loved was Laura Merton, the daughter of a retired colonel, who had lost his temper and his digestion in India and had never found either of them again. Laura adored him, and he was ready to kiss her shoestrings. They were the handsomest couple in London, and had not a penny piece between them. The colonel was very fond of Hughie, but would not hear of any engagement. "Come to me, my boy, when you have got 10,000 pounds of your own, and we will see about it," he used to say. And Hughie looked very glum in those days, and had to go to Laura for consolation. One morning, as he was on his way to Holland Park, where the Mertons lived, he dropped in to see a great friend of his, Alan Trevor. Trevor was a painter. Indeed, few people escape that nowadays, but he was also an artist, and artists are rather rare. Personally, he was a strange, rough fellow, with a freckled face and a red, ragged beard. However, when he took up the brush he was a real master, and his pictures were eagerly sought after. He had been very much attracted by Hughie at first, it must be acknowledged, entirely on account of his personal charm. "The only people a painter should know," he used to say, "are people who are bait and beautiful, people who are an artistic pleasure to look at and an intellectual repose to talk to. Men who are dandies and women who are darlings rule the world. At least they should do so." However, after he got to know Hughie better, he liked him quite as much for his bright, buoyant spirits and his generous, reckless nature, and had given him the permanent entrée to his studio. When Hughie came in, he found Trevor putting the finishing touches to a wonderful life-size picture of a beggar-man. The beggar himself was standing on a raised platform in a corner of the studio. He was a wizened old man with a face like wrinkled parchment, and a most piteous expression. Over his shoulders was flung a coarse brown cloak, all tears and tatters. His thick boots were patched and cobbled, and with one hand he leant on a rough stick, while with the other he held out his battered hat for alms. "What an amazing model!" whispered Hughie, as he shook hands with his friend. "An amazing model!" shouted Trevor at the top of his voice. "I should think so. Such beggars as he are not to be met with every day. À trouvaille, mon cher, a living Velasquez. My stars, what an etching Rembrandt would have made of him." "Poor old chap," said Hughie, "how miserable he looks. But I suppose to you painters his face is his fortune." "Certainly," replied Trevor. "You don't want a beggar to look happy, do you?" "How much does a model get for sitting?" asked Hughie, as he found himself a comfortable seat on a divan. "A shilling an hour." "And how much do you get for your picture, Alan?" "Oh, for this I get 2,000. "Pounds?" "Guineas. Painters, poets, and physicians always get guineas." "Well, I think the model should have a percentage," cried Hughie, laughing. "They work quite as hard as you do." "Nonsense, nonsense! Why, look at the trouble of laying on all the paint alone, and standing all day long at one's easel. It's all very well, Hughie, for you to talk, but I assure you that there are moments when art almost attains to the dignity of manual labor. But you mustn't chatter, I'm very busy. Smoke a cigarette and keep quiet." After some time the servant came in and told Trevor that the frame-maker wanted to speak to him. "Don't run away, Hughie," he said as he went out. "I'll be back in a moment." The old beggar-man took advantage of Trevor's absence to rest for a moment on a wooden bench that was behind him. He looked so forlorn and wretched that Hughie could not help pitying him, and felt in his pockets to see what money he had. All he could find was a sovereign and some coppers. "Poor old fellow," he thought to himself, "he wants it more than I do, but it means no hansoms for a fortnight." And he walked across the studio and slipped the sovereign into the beggar's hand. The old man started, and a faint smile flitted across his withered lips. "Thank you, sir," he said, "thank you." Then Trevor arrived, and Hughie took his leave, blushing a little at what he had done. He spent the day with Laura, got a charming scolding for his extravagance, and had to walk home. That night he strolled into the Pallet Club about 11 o'clock, and found Trevor sitting by himself in the smoking-room, drinking hock and seltzer. "Well, Alan, did you get the picture finished all right?" he said, as he lit his cigarette. "Finished and framed, my boy," answered Trevor. "And by the by, You have made a conquest. That old model you saw is quite devoted to you. I had to tell him all about you, who you are, where you live, and what your income was, what prospects you have. My dear Alan, cried Hughie, I shall probably find him waiting for me when I go home. But of course you are only joking, poor old wretch. I wish I could do something for him. I think it is dreadful that anyone should be so miserable. I have got heaps of old clothes at home. Do you think he would care for any of them? Why, his rags were falling to bits. But he looks splendid in them, said Trevor. I wouldn't paint him in a frock coat for anything. What you call rags, I call romance. What seems poverty to you is picturesqueness to me. However, I'll tell him of your offer. Alan, said Hughie seriously, you painters are a heartless lot. An artist's heart is his head, replied Trevor, and besides, our business is to realize the world as we see it, not to reform it as we know it. À chacun son métier. And now tell me how Laura is. The old model was quite interested in her. You don't mean to say that you talked to him about her, said Hughie. Certainly I did. He knows all about the relentless colonel, the lovely Laura, and the 10,000 pounds. You told that old beggar all my private affairs? Cried Hughie, looking very red and angry. My dear boy, said Trevor, smiling, that old beggar, as you call him, is one of the richest men in Europe. He could buy all London tomorrow without overdrawing his account. He has a house in every capital, dines off gold plate, and can prevent Russia from going to war when he chooses. What on earth do you mean? Exclaimed Hughie. What I say, said Trevor. The old man you saw today in the studio was Baron Hausberg. He is a great friend of mine, buys all my pictures and that sort of thing, and gave me a commission a month ago to paint him as a beggar. Que voulez-vous, la fantaisie d'un millionnaire? And I must say he made a magnificent figure in his rags, or perhaps I should say in my rags. They are an old suit I got in Spain. Baron Hausberg, cried Hughie. Good heavens, I gave him a sovereign, and he sank into an armchair, the picture of dismay. Gave him a sovereign, shouted Trevor, and he burst into a roar of laughter. My dear boy, you'll never see it again. Son affaire, c'est l'argent des autres. I think you might have told me, Alan, said Hughie sulkily, and not have let me make such a fool of myself. Well, to begin with, Hughie, said Trevor, it never entered my mind that you went about distributing alms in that reckless way. I can understand your kissing a pretty model, but your giving a sovereign to an ugly one? By Jove, no. Besides, the fact is that I really was not at home today to anyone, and when you came in I didn't know whether Hausberg would like his name mentioned. You know, he wasn't in full dress. What a duffer he must think me, said Hughie. Not at all. He was in the highest spirits after you left, kept chuckling to himself and rubbing his old wrinkled hands together. I couldn't make out why he was so interested to know all about you, but I see it all now. He'll invest your sovereign for you, Hughie, pay you the interest every 6 months, and have a capital story to tell after dinner. I am an unlucky devil, growled Hughie. The best thing I can do is go to bed, and, my dear Alan, you mustn't tell anyone. I shouldn't dare show my face in the Row. Nonsense. It reflects the highest credit on your philanthropic spirit, Hughie. And don't run away. Have another cigarette, and you can talk about Laura as much as you like. However, Hughie wouldn't stop, but walked home, feeling very unhappy and leaving Alan Trevor in fits of laughter. The next morning, as he was at breakfast, the servant brought him up a card, on which was written, Monsieur Gustave Naudin, de la part de Monsieur le Baron Hausberg. I suppose he has come for an apology, said Hughie to himself, and he told the servant to show the visitor up. An old gentleman with gold spectacles and grey hair came into the room, and said in a slight French accent, Have I the honour of addressing Monsieur Erskine? Hughie bowed. I have come from Baron Hausberg, he continued. The Baron— I beg, sir, that you will offer him my sincerest apologies, stammered Hughie. The Baron, said the old gentleman with a smile, has commissioned me to bring you this letter, and he extended a sealed envelope. On the outside was written, A wedding present to Hughie Erskine and Laura Merton from an old beggar, and inside was a cheque for 10,000 pounds. When they were married, Alan Trevor was the best man, and the Baron made a speech at the wedding breakfast. Millionaire models, remarked Alan, are rare enough, but by Jove, model millionaires are rarer still. End of The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. Read by Nicodemus.
The Strange-Looking Man by Fanny Kemble Johnson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Strange-Looking Man by Fanny Kemble Johnson. From the Pagan. A tiny village lay among the mountains of a country from which for 4 years the men had gone forth to fight. First the best men had gone, then the older men, then the youths, and lastly the schoolboys. It will be seen that no men could have been left in the village except the very aged, and the bodily incapacitated, who soon died, owing to the war policy of the government, which was to let the useless perish that there might be more food for the useful. Now it chanced that while all the men went away, save those left to die of slow starvation, only a few returned, and these few were crippled and disfigured in various ways. One young man had only part of a face, and had to wear a painted tin mask, like a holiday maker. Another had 2 legs, but no arms, and another 2 arms, but no legs. One man could scarcely be looked at by his own mother, having had his eyes burned out of his head until he stared like death. One had neither arms nor legs, and was mad of his misery besides, and lay all day in a cradle like a baby. And there was a quite old man who strangled night and day from having sucked in poison gas, and another, a mere boy, who shook like a leaf in a high wind from shell shock, and screamed at a sound. And he too had lost a hand, and part of his face, though not enough to warrant the expense of a mask for him. All these men, except he who had been crazed by horror of himself, had been furnished with ingenious appliances to enable them to be partly self-supporting, and to earn enough to pay their share of the taxes which burdened their defeated nation. To go through that village after the war was something like going through a life-sized toy village, with all the mechanical figures wound up and clicking. Only instead of the figures being new and gay and pretty, they were battered and grotesque and inhuman. There would be the windmill and the smithy and the public house. There would be the row of cottages, the village church, the sparkling waterfall, the parti-coloured fields spread out like bright kerchiefs on the hillsides, the parading fowl, the goats and cows, though not many of these last. There would be the women, and with them some children, very few, however, for the women had been getting reasonable, and were now refusing to have sons who might one day be sent back to them limbless and mad, to be rocked in cradles for many years perhaps. Still the younger women, softer creatures of impulse, had borne a child or 2. One of these, born the 2nd year of the war, was a very blonde and bullet-headed rascal of 3, with a bullying air and a roving disposition. But such traits appear engaging in children of sufficiently tender years, and he was a sort of village plaything, here, there, and everywhere, on the most familiar terms with the wrecks of the war which the government of that country had made. He tried on the tin mask and played with the baker's mechanical leg, so indulgent were they of his caprices, and it amused him excessively to rock the cradle of the man who had no limbs, and who was his father. In and out he ran, and was humoured to his bent. To one he seemed the son he had lost, to another the son he might have had the world gone differently. To others he served as a bright escape from the shadow of a future without hope. To others yet, the diversion of an hour. This last was especially true of the blind man who sat at the door of his old mother's cottage binding brooms. The presence of the child seemed to him like a warm ray of sunshine falling across his hand, and he would lure him to linger by, letting him try on the great blue goggles which he found it best to wear in public. But no disfigurement or deformity appeared to frighten the little fellow. These had been his playthings from earliest infancy. One morning his mother, being busy washing clothes, had left him alone, confident that he would soon seek out some friendly fragment of soldier, and entertain himself till noon and hunger time. But occasionally children have odd notions, and do the exact opposite of what one supposes. On this brilliant summer morning the child fancied a solitary ramble along the bank of the mountain stream. Vaguely he meant to seek a pool higher up, and to cast stones in it. He wandered slowly, straying now and then into small valleys, or chasing wayside ducks. It was past 10 before he gained the green gleaming and foam whitened pool, sunk in the shadow of a tall grey rock, over whose flat top 3 pine trees swayed in the fresh breeze. Under them, looking to the child like a white cloud in a green sky, stood a beautiful young man, poised on the sheer brink for a dive. A single instant he stood there, clad only in shadow and sunshine. The next he had dived so expertly that he scarcely splashed up the water around him. Then his dark, dripping head rose in sight, his glittering arm thrust up, and he swam vigorously to shore. He climbed the rock for another dive. These actions he repeated in pure sport and joy in life so often that his little spectator became dizzy with watching. At length he had enough of it, and stopped for his discarded garments. These he carried to a more sheltered spot, and rapidly put on, the child still wide-eyed and wondering, for indeed he had much to occupy his attention. He had 2 arms, 2 legs, a whole face with eyes, nose, mouth, chin, and ears complete. He could see, for he had glanced about him as he dressed. He could speak, for he sang loudly. He could hear, for he had turned quickly at the whir of pigeon wings behind him. His skin was smooth all over, and nowhere on it were the dark scarlet maps which the child found so interesting on the arms, face, and breast of the burned man. He did not strangle every little while, or shiver madly, and scream at a sound. It was truly inexplicable, and therefore terrifying. The child was beginning to whimper, to tremble, to look wildly about for his mother, when the young man observed him. "Hello!" he cried eagerly, "if it isn't a child!" He came forward across the footbridge with a most ingratiating smile, for this was the first time that day he had seen a child, and he had been thinking it remarkable that there should be so few children in a valley, where, when he had travelled that way 5 years before, there had been so many he had scarcely been able to find pennies for them. He cried "Hullo!" quite joyously, and searched in his pockets. But, To his amazement, the bullet-headed little blond boy screamed out in terror, and fled for protection into the arms of a hurriedly approaching young woman. She embraced him with evident relief, and was lavishing on him terms of scolding and endearment in the same breath, when the traveller came up, looking as if his feelings were hurt. "I assure you, madam," said he, "that I only meant to give your little boy these pennies." He examined himself with an air of wonder. "What on earth is there about me to frighten a child?" he queried plaintively. The young peasant woman smiled indulgently on them both, on the child now sobbing, his face buried in her skirt, and on the boyish, perplexed, and beautiful young man. "It is because he finds the Herr Traveller so strange looking," she said, curtsying. "He is quite small." She showed his smallness with a gesture, "and it is the first time he has ever seen a whole man." End of story.
Useless Beauty by Guy de Maupassant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Robinson, Carbondale, Illinois. 1. About 5:30 one afternoon at the end of June, when the sun was shining warm and bright into the large courtyard, a very elegant victoria with 2 beautiful black horses drew up in front of the mansion. The Comtesse de Mascaret came down the steps just as her husband, who was coming home, appeared in the carriage entrance. He stopped for a few moments to look at his wife and turned rather pale. The Countess was very beautiful, graceful and distinguished looking, with her long oval face, her complexion like yellow ivory, her large gray eyes and her black hair, and she got into her carriage without looking at him, without even seeming to have noticed him, with such a particularly high-bred air that the furious jealousy by which he had been devoured for so long again gnawed at his heart. He went up to her and said, "You are going for a drive?" She merely replied disdainfully, "You see I am." "In the Bois de Boulogne?" "Most probably." "May I come with you?" "The carriage belongs to you." Without being surprised at the tone in which she answered him, he got in and sat down by his wife's side and said, "Bois de Boulogne." The footman jumped up beside the coachman, and the horses as usual pranced and tossed their heads until they were in the street. Husband and wife sat side by side without speaking. He was thinking how to begin a conversation, but she maintained such an obstinately hard look that he did not venture to make the attempt. At last, however, he cunningly, accidentally as it were, touched the Countess' gloved hand with his own, but she drew her arm away with a movement which was so expressive of disgust that he remained thoughtful in spite of his usual authoritative and despotic character, and he said, "Gabrielle, what do you want?" "I think you are looking adorable." She did not reply, but remained lying back in the carriage, looking like an irritated queen. By that time they were driving up the Champs-Élysées toward the Arc de Triomphe. That immense monument at the end of the long avenue raised its colossal arch against the red sky, and the sun seemed to be descending on it, showering fiery dust on it from the sky. The stream of carriages, with dashes of sunlight reflected in the silver trappings of the harness and the glass of the lamps, flowed on in a double current toward the town and toward the Bois, and the Comte de Mascaret continued, "My dear Gabrielle." Unable to control herself any longer, she replied in an exasperated voice, "Oh, Do leave me in peace, pray. I am not even allowed to have my carriage to myself now." He pretended not to hear her and continued, "You never have looked so pretty as you do today." Her patience had come to an end, and she replied with irrepressible anger, "You are wrong to notice it, for I swear to you that I will never have anything to do with you in that way again." The Count was decidedly stupefied and upset, and his violent nature gaining the upper hand, he exclaimed, "What do you mean by that?" in a tone that betrayed rather the brutal master than the lover. She replied in a low voice, so that the servants might not hear amid the deafening noise of the wheels, "Ah, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? Now I recognize you again. Do you want me to tell everything?" "Yes." "Everything that has weighed on my heart since I have been the victim of your terrible selfishness?" He had grown red with surprise and anger, and he growled between his closed teeth, "Yes, tell me everything." He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a big red beard, a handsome man, a nobleman, a man of the world, who passed as a perfect husband and an excellent father, and now, for the first time since they had started, she turned toward him and looked him full in the face. "Ah, you will hear some disagreeable things, but you must know that I am prepared for everything, that I fear nothing, and you less than anyone today." He also was looking into her eyes, and was already shaking with rage as he said in a low voice, "You are mad." "No, but I will no longer be the victim of the hateful penalty of maternity, which you have inflicted on me for 11 years. I wish to take my place in society as I have the right to do, as all women have the right to do." He suddenly grew pale again and stammered, I do not understand you." "Oh, yes, you understand me well enough. It is now 3 months since I had my last child, and as I am still very beautiful, and as, in spite of all your efforts, you cannot spoil my figure, as you just now perceived when you saw me on the doorstep, you think it is time that I should think of having another child. But you are talking nonsense." "No, I am not. I am 30, and I have had 7 children, and we have been married 11 years, and you hope that this will go on for 10 years longer, after which you will leave off being jealous." He seized her arm and squeezed it, saying, "I will not allow you to talk to me like that much longer." "And I shall talk to you till the end, until I have finished all I have to say to you, and if you try to prevent me, I shall raise my voice so that the 2 servants who are on the box may hear. I only allowed you to come with me for that object, for I have these witnesses who will oblige you to listen to me and to contain yourself. So now pay attention to what I say. I have always felt an antipathy to you, and I have always let you see it, for I have never lied, monsieur. You married me in spite of myself. You forced my parents, who were in embarrassed circumstances, to give me to you because you were rich, and they obliged me to marry you in spite of my tears. So you bought me. And as soon as I was in your power, as soon as I had become your companion, ready to attach myself to you, to forget your coercive and threatening proceedings, in order that I might only remember that I ought to be a devoted wife, and to love you as much as it might be possible for me to love you, you became jealous, you, as no man has ever before, with the base, ignoble jealousy of a spy, which was as degrading to you as it was to me. I had not been married 8 months when you suspected me of every perfidiousness, and you even told me so. What a disgrace! And as you could not prevent me from being beautiful, and from pleasing people, from being called in drawing rooms and also in the newspapers one of the most beautiful women in Paris, you tried everything you could think of to keep admirers from me. and you hit upon the abominable idea of making me spend my life in a constant state of motherhood, until the time should come when I should disgust every man. Oh, do not deny it. I did not understand it for some time, but then I guessed it. You even boasted about it to your sister, who told me of it, for she is fond of me and was disgusted at your boorish coarseness. Ah, remember how you had behaved in the past, how for 11 years you had compelled me to give up all society and simply be a mother to your children. And then you would grow disgusted with me, and I was sent into the country, the family chateau among fields and meadows, and when I reappeared, fresh, pretty and unspoiled, still seductive and constantly surrounded by admirers, hoping that at last I should live a little more like a rich young society woman, you were seized with jealousy again, and you began once more to persecute me with that infamous and hateful desire from which you are suffering at this moment by my side. And it is not the desire of possessing me, for I should never have refused myself to you, but it is the wish to make me unsightly. And then that abominable and mysterious thing occurred which I was a long time in understanding, but I grew sharp by dint of watching your thoughts and actions. You attached yourself to your children with all the security which they gave you while I bore them. You felt affection for them with all your aversion to me, and in spite of your ignoble fears, which were momentarily allayed by your pleasure in seeing me lose my symmetry. Oh, how often have I noticed that joy in you! I have seen it in your eyes and guessed it. You loved your children as victories, and not because they were of your own blood. They were victories over me, over my youth, over my beauty, over my charms, over the compliments which were paid me, and over those that were whispered around me without being paid to me personally. And you are proud of them, you make a parade of them, you take them out for drives in your break in the Bois de Boulogne, and you give them donkey rides at Montmorency. You take them to theatrical matinees so that you may be seen in the midst of them, so that people may say, "What a kind father!" and that it may be repeated. He had seized her wrist with savage brutality, and he squeezed it so violently that she was quiet and nearly cried out with the pain, and he said to her in a whisper, "I love my children, do you hear? What you have just told me is disgraceful in a mother, but you belong to me. I am master, your master. I can exact from you what I like and when I like, and I have the law on my side." He was trying to crush her fingers in the strong grip of his large, muscular hand, and she, livid with pain, tried in vain to free them from that vice which was crushing them. The agony made her breathe hard, and the tears came into her eyes. "You see that I am the master and the stronger," he said. When he somewhat loosened his grip, she asked him, "Do you think that I am a religious woman?" He was surprised and stammered, "Yes." "Do you think that I could lie if I swore to the truth of anything to you before an altar on which Christ's body is?" "No." "Will you go with me to some church?" "What for?" "You shall see. Will you?" "If you absolutely wish it, yes." She raised her voice and said, "Philippe!" And the coachman, bending down a little, without taking his eyes from his horses, seemed to turn his ear alone toward his mistress, who continued, "Drive to Saint Philippe du Roule," and the Victoria, which had reached the entrance of the Bois de Boulogne, returned to Paris. Husband and wife did not exchange a word further during the drive, and when the carriage stopped before the church, Madame de Mascaret jumped out and entered it, followed by the Count a few yards distant. She went without stopping as far as the choir screen, and falling on her knees at a chair, she buried her face in her hands. She prayed for a long time, and he, standing behind her, could see that she was crying. She wept noiselessly, as women weep when they are in great, poignant grief. There was a kind of undulation in her body, which ended in a little sob, which was hidden and stifled by her fingers. But the Comte de Mascaret thought that the situation was lasting too long, and he touched her on the shoulder. That contact recalled her to herself, as if she had been burned, and getting up she looked straight into his eyes. "This is what I have to say to you. I am afraid of nothing, whatever you may do to me. You may kill me if you like. One of your children is not yours, and one only. That I swear to you before God who hears me here. That was the only revenge that was possible for me in return for all your abominable masculine tyrannies, in return for the penal servitude of childbearing to which you had condemned me. Who is my lover? That you never will know. You may suspect everyone, but you never will find out. I gave myself to him without love and without pleasure, only for the sake of betraying you, and he also made me a mother. Which is the child? That also you never will know. I have 7. Try to find out. I intended to tell you this later, for one had not avenged oneself on a man by deceiving him unless he knows it. You had driven me to confess it today. I have now finished." She hurried through the church toward the open door, expecting to hear behind her the quick step of her husband, whom she had defied, and to be knocked to the ground by a blow of his fist, but she heard nothing and reached her carriage. She jumped into it at a bound, overwhelmed with anguish and breathless with fear, so she called out to the coachman, "Home!" and the horses set off at a quick trot. 2. The Comtesse de Mascaret was waiting in her room for dinner time, as a criminal sentenced to death awaits the hour of his execution. What was her husband going to do? Had he come home? Despotic, passionate, ready for any violence as he was, what was he meditating? What had he made up his mind to do? There was no sound in the house, and every moment she looked at the clock. Her lady's maid had come and dressed her for the evening, and had then left the room again. 8 o'clock struck, and almost at the same moment there were 2 knocks at the door, and the butler came in and announced dinner. "Has the Count come in?" "Yes, Madame la Comtesse. He is in the dining room." For a little moment she felt inclined to arm herself with a small revolver which she had bought some time before, foreseeing the tragedy which was being rehearsed in her heart. But she remembered that all the children would be there, and she took nothing except a bottle of smelling salts. He rose somewhat ceremoniously from his chair. They exchanged a slight bow and sat down. The 3 boys, with their tutor, Abbe Martin, were on her right, and the 3 girls, with Miss Smith, their English governess, were on her left. The youngest child, who was only 3 months old, remained upstairs with his nurse. The abbé said grace as usual when there was no company, for the children did not come down to dinner when guests were present. Then they began dinner. The Countess, suffering from emotion, which she had not calculated upon, remained with her eyes cast down, while the Count scrutinized now the 3 boys and now the 3 girls, with an uncertain, unhappy expression, which traveled from one to the other. Suddenly pushing his wine-glass from him, it broke, and the wine was spilt on the tablecloth, and at the slight noise caused by this little accident the Countess started up from her chair, and for the first time they looked at each other. Then, in spite of themselves, in spite of the irritation of their nerves caused by every glance, they continued to exchange looks, rapid as pistol shots. The abbé, who felt that there was some cause for embarrassment which he could not divine, attempted to begin a conversation, and tried various subjects, but his useless efforts gave rise to no ideas and did not bring out a word. The Countess, with feminine tact and obeying her instincts of a woman of the world, attempted to answer him 2 or 3 times, but in vain. She could not find words in the perplexity of her mind, and her own voice almost frightened her in the silence of the large room, where nothing was heard except the slight sound of plates and knives and forks. Suddenly her husband said to her, bending forward, "Here, amid your children, will you swear to me that what you told me just now is true?" The hatred which was fermenting in her veins suddenly roused her, and replying to that question with the same firmness with which she had replied to his looks, she raised both her hands, the right pointing toward the boys and the left toward the girls, and said in a firm, resolute voice and without any hesitation, "On the head of my children, I swear that I have told you the truth." He got up and, throwing his table napkin on the table with a movement of exasperation, he turned round and flung his chair against the wall, and then went out without another word, while she, uttering a deep sigh as if after a first victory, went on in a calm voice, "You must not pay any attention to what your father has just said, my darlings. He was very much upset a short time ago, but he will be all right again in a few days." Then she talked with the abbé and Miss Smith, and had tender, pretty words for all her children, those sweet, tender mother's ways which unfold little hearts. When dinner was over, she went into the drawing-room, all her children following her. She made the elder ones chatter, and when their bedtime came, she kissed them for a long time, and then went alone into her room. She waited, for she had no doubt that the Count would come, and she made up her mind then, as her children were not with her, to protect herself as a woman of the world, as she would protect her life, and in the pocket of her dress she put the little loaded revolver which she had bought a few days previously. The hours went by, the hours struck, and every sound was hushed in the house. Only the cabs continued to rumble through the streets, but their noise was only heard vaguely through the shuttered and curtained windows. She waited, full of nervous energy, without any fear of him now, ready for anything, and almost triumphant, for she had found means of torturing him continually during every moment of his life. But the first gleam of dawn came in through the fringe at the bottom of her curtain without his having come into her room, and then she awoke to the fact, with much amazement, that he was not coming. Having locked and bolted her door for greater security, she went to bed at last and remained there, with her eyes open, thinking and barely understanding it all, without being able to guess what he was going to do. When her maid brought her tea, she at the same time handed her a letter from her husband. He told her that he was going to undertake a longish journey, and in a postscript added that his lawyer would provide her with any sums of money she might require for all her expenses. 3. It was at the opera, between 2 acts of Robert the Devil. In the stalls the men were standing up with their hats on, their waistcoats cut very low so as to show a large amount of white shirt front, in which gold and jeweled studs glistened, and were looking at the boxes full of ladies in low dresses covered with diamonds and pearls, who were expanding like flowers in that illuminated hothouse, where the beauty of their faces and the whiteness of their shoulders seemed to bloom in order to be gazed at amid the sound of the music and of human voices. Two friends, with their backs to the orchestra, were scanning those rows of elegance, that exhibition of real or false charms, of jewels, of luxury, and of pretension which displayed itself in all parts of the grand theatre, and one of them, Roger de Senlis, said to his companion, Bernard Grandin, "Just look how beautiful the Comtesse de Mascaret still is." The older man in turn looked through his opera glasses at a tall lady in a box opposite. She appeared to be still very young, and her striking beauty seemed to attract all eyes in every corner of the house. Her pale complexion, of an ivory tint, gave her the appearance of a statue, while a small diamond coronet glistened on her black hair like a streak of light. When he had looked at her for some time, Bernard Grandin replied with a jocular accent of sincere conviction, "You may well call her beautiful." "How old do you think she is?" "Wait a moment. I can tell you exactly, for I have known her since she was a child, and I saw her make her debut into society when she was quite a girl. She is 36. "Impossible." "I am sure of it." "She looks 25. She has had 7 children." "It is incredible." "And what is more, they are all 7 alive, as she is a very good mother. I occasionally go to the house, which is a very quiet and pleasant one, where one may see the phenomenon of the family in the midst of society." "How very strange! And have there never been any reports about her?" "Never." "But what about her husband? He is peculiar, is he not?" "Yes and no. Very likely there has been a little drama between them, one of those little domestic dramas which one suspects, never finds out exactly, but guesses at pretty closely." "What is it?" "I do not know anything about it. Mascaret leads a very fast life now after being a model husband. As long as he remained a good spouse, he had a shocking temper, was crabbed and easily took offense, but since he has been leading his present wild life, he has become quite different. But one might surmise that he has some trouble, a worm gnawing somewhere, for he has aged very much." Thereupon the two friends talked philosophically for some minutes about the secret, unknowable troubles which differences of character, or perhaps physical antipathies, which were not perceived at first, give rise to in families. And then Roger de Senlis, who was still looking at Madame de Mascaret through his opera glasses, said, "It is almost incredible that that woman can have had 7 children." "Yes, in 11 years. After which, when she was 30, she refused to have any more, in order to take her place in society, which she seems likely to do for many years." "Poor women." "Why do you pity them?" "Why? Ah, my dear fellow, just consider. 11 years in a condition of motherhood for such a woman! What a hell! All her youth, all her beauty, every hope of success, every poetical ideal of a brilliant life sacrificed to that abominable law of reproduction which turns the normal woman into a mere machine for bringing children into the world. What would you have? It is only nature." "Yes, but I say that nature is our enemy, that we must always fight against nature, for she is continually bringing us back to an animal state. You may be sure that God has not put anything on this earth that is clean, pretty, elegant, or accessory to our ideal. The human brain has done it. It is man who has introduced a little grace, beauty, unknown charm and mystery into creation by singing about it, interpreting it, by admiring it as a poet, idealizing it as an artist, and by explaining it through science, doubtless making mistakes, but finding ingenious reasons, hidden grace and beauty, unknown charm and mystery in the various phenomena of nature. God created only coarse beings, full of germs of disease, who, after a few years of bestial enjoyment, grow old and infirm, with all the ugliness and all the want of power of human decrepitude. He seems to have made them only in order that they may reproduce their species in an ignoble manner and then die like ephemeral insects. I said reproduce their species in an ignoble manner, and I adhere to that expression. What is there, as a matter of fact, more ignoble and more repugnant than that act of reproduction of living beings, against which all delicate minds always have revolted and always will revolt? Since all the organs which have been invented by this economical and malicious Creator serve two purposes, why did he not choose another method of performing that sacred mission, which is the noblest and the most exalted of all human functions? The mouth, which nourishes the body by means of material food, also diffuses abroad speech and thought. Our flesh renews itself of its own accord while we are thinking about it. The olfactory organs, through which the vital air reaches the lungs, communicate all the perfumes of the world to the brain, the smell of flowers, of woods, of trees, of the sea. The ear, which enables us to communicate with our fellow men, has also allowed us to invent music, to create dreams, happiness infinite, and even physical pleasure by means of sound. But one might say that the cynical and cunning Creator wished to prohibit man from ever ennobling and idealizing his intercourse with women. Nevertheless, man has found love, which is not a bad reply to that sly deity, and he has adorned it with so much poetry that woman often forgets the sensual part of it. Those among us who are unable to deceive themselves have invented vice and refined debauchery, which is another way of laughing at God and paying homage, immodest homage, to beauty. But the normal man begets children just like an animal coupled with another by law. Look at that woman! Is it not abominable to think that such a jewel, such a pearl, born to be beautiful, admired, feted and adored, has spent 11 years of her life in providing heirs for the Comte de Mascaret? Bernard Grandin replied with a laugh, "There's a great deal of truth in all that, but very few people would understand you." Salnus became more and more animated. "Do you know how I picture God myself?" he said. "As an enormous creative organ beyond our ken, who scatters millions of worlds into space, just as one single fish would deposit its spawn in the sea. He creates because it is his function as God to do so, but he does not know what he is doing, and is stupidly prolific in his work, and is ignorant of the combinations of all kinds which are produced by his scattered germs. The human mind is a lucky little local passing accident, which was totally unforeseen, and condemned to disappear with this earth, and to recommence, perhaps here or elsewhere, the same or different, with fresh combinations of eternally new beginnings. We owe it to this little lapse of intelligence on his part, that we are very uncomfortable in this world, which was not made for us, which had not been prepared to receive us, to lodge and feed us, or to satisfy reflecting beings, and we owe it to him also that we have to struggle without ceasing against what are still called the designs of Providence, when we are really refined and civilized beings." Grandin, who was listening to him attentively, as he had long known the surprising outbursts of his imagination, asked him, "Then you believe that human thought is the spontaneous product of blind divine generation?" "Naturally! a fortuitous function of the nerve centers of our brain, like the unforeseen chemical action due to new mixtures, and similar also to a charge of electricity caused by friction or the unexpected proximity of some substance, similar to all phenomena caused by the infinite and fruitful fermentation of living matter. But, my dear fellow, the truth of this must be evident to anyone who looks about him. If the human mind, ordained by an omniscient Creator, had been intended to be what it has become, exacting, inquiring, agitated, tormented, so different from mere animal thought and resignation, would the world, which was created to receive the beings which we now are, have been this unpleasant little park for small game, this salad patch, this wooded, rocky, and spherical kitchen garden where your improvident providence has destined us to live naked, in caves or under trees, nourished on the flesh of slaughtered animals, our brethren, or on raw vegetables nourished by the sun and the rain? But it is sufficient to reflect for a moment, in order to understand that this world was not made for such creatures as we are. Thought, which is developed by a miracle in the nerves of the cells in our brain, powerless, ignorant, and confused as it is, and as it will always remain, makes all of us who are intellectual beings eternal and wretched exiles on earth. Look at this earth, as God has given it to those who inhabit it. Is it not visibly and solely made, planted and covered with forests for the sake of animals? What is there for us? Nothing. And for them everything. And they have nothing to do but to eat or go hunting and eat each other according to their instincts. For God never foresaw gentleness and peaceable manners. He only foresaw the death of creatures which were bent on destroying and devouring each other. Are not the quail, the pigeon, and the partridge the natural prey of the hawk? The sheep, the stag, and the ox, that of the great flesh-eating animals, rather than meat to be fattened and served up to us with truffles, which have been unearthed by pigs for our special benefit? As to ourselves, the more civilized, intellectual, and refined we are, the more we ought to conquer and subdue that animal instinct which represents the will of God in us. And so, in order to mitigate our lot as brutes, we have discovered and made everything, beginning with houses, then exquisite food, sauces, sweetmeats, pastry, drinks, stuffs, clothes, ornaments, beds, mattresses, carriages, railways, and innumerable machines. Besides arts and sciences, writing and poetry. Every ideal comes from us, as do all the amenities of life, in order to make our existence as simple reproducers, for which divine providence solely intended us, less monotonous and less hard. Look at this theater. Is there not here a human world created by us, unforeseen and unknown to eternal fate, intelligible to our minds alone, a sensual and intellectual distraction which has been invented solely by and for that discontented and restless little animal, man? Look at that woman, Madame de Mascaret. God intended her to live in a cave, naked, or wrapped up in the skins of wild animals. But is she not better as she is? But speaking of her, does anyone know why and how her brute of a husband, having such a companion by his side, and especially after having been boorish enough to make her a mother 7 times, has suddenly left her to run after bad women? Grandin replied, "Ah, my dear fellow, this is probably the only reason. He found that raising a family was becoming too expensive, and from reasons of domestic economy, he has arrived at the same principles which you lay down as a philosopher." Just then the curtain rose for the 3rd act. and they turned round, took off their hats, and sat down. 4. The Comte and Comtesse Mascaret were sitting side by side in the carriage which was taking them home from the opera, without speaking, but suddenly the husband said to his wife, "Gabrielle, what do you want?" "Don't you think that this has lasted long enough?" "What?" "The horrible punishment to which you have condemned me for the last 6 years." "What do you want? I cannot help it." "Then tell me which of them it is." "Never." "Think that I can no longer see my children or feel them around me without having my heart burdened with this doubt? Tell me which of them it is, and I swear that I will forgive you and treat it like the others." "I have not the right to do so." "Do you not see that I can no longer endure this life, this thought which is wearing me out, or this question which I am constantly asking myself, this question which tortures me each time I look at them? It is driving me mad." "Then you have suffered a great deal?" she said. "Terribly. Should I, without that, have accepted the horror of living by your side, and the still greater horror of feeling and knowing that there is one among them whom I cannot recognize, and who prevents me from loving the others?" "Then you have really suffered very much?" she repeated. And he replied in a constrained and sorrowful voice, "Yes, for do I not tell you every day that it is intolerable torture to me? Should I have remained in that house, near you and them, if I did not love them? Oh, you have behaved abominably toward me. All the affection of my heart I have bestowed upon my children, and that you know. I am for them a father of the olden time, as I was for you a husband of one of the families of old, for by instinct I've remained a natural man, a man of former days. Yes, I will confess it, you have made me terribly jealous, because you are a woman of another race, of another soul, with other requirements. Oh, I shall never forget the things you said to me. But from that day I troubled myself no more about you. I did not kill you, because then I should have had no means on earth of ever discovering which of your children is not mine. I have waited, but I have suffered more than you would believe, for I can no longer venture to love them, except perhaps the 2 eldest. I no longer venture to look at them, to call them to me, to kiss them. I cannot take them on my knee without asking myself, can it be this one? I have been correct in my behavior toward you for 6 years, and even kind and complacent. Tell me the truth, and I swear that I will do nothing unkind." He thought, in spite of the darkness of the carriage, that he could perceive that she was moved, and, feeling certain that she was going to speak at last, he said, "I beg you, I beseech you to tell me," he said. "I have been more guilty than you think, perhaps," she replied, "but I could no longer endure that life of continual motherhood, and I had only one means of driving you from me. I lied before God, and I lied with my hand raised to my children's head, for I never have wronged you." He seized her arm in the darkness, and squeezing it as he had done on that terrible day of their drive in the Bois de Boulogne, he stammered, "Is that true?" "It is true." But, wild with grief, he said with a groan, "I shall have fresh doubts that will never end. When did you lie? The last time or now? How am I to believe you at present? How can one believe a woman after that? I shall never again know what I am to think. I would rather you had said to me, 'It is Jacques,' or 'It is Jean.'" The carriage drove into the courtyard of the house, and when it had drawn up in front of the steps, the Count alighted first, as usual, and offered his wife his arm to mount the stairs. As soon as they reached the first floor, he said, "May I speak to you for a few moments longer?" And she replied, "I am quite willing." They went into a small drawing room, and a footman, in some surprise, lighted the waxed candles. As soon as he had left the room and they were alone, the Count continued, "How am I to know the truth? I have begged you 1,000 times to speak, but you have remained dumb, impenetrable, inflexible, inexorable, and now today you tell me that you have been lying. For 6 years you have actually allowed me to believe such a thing. No, you are lying now. I do not know why, but out of pity for me, perhaps." She replied in a sincere and convincing manner, "If I had not done so, I should have had 4 more children in the last 6 years." "Can a mother speak like that?" "Oh," she replied, "I do not feel that I am the mother of children who never have been born. It is enough for me to be the mother of those that I have, and to love them with all my heart. I am a woman of the civilized world, monsieur. We all are. And we are no longer, and we refuse to be, mere females to restock the earth." She got up, but he seized her hands. "Only one word, Gabrielle. Tell me the truth." "I have just told you. I never have dishonored you." He looked her full in the face, and how beautiful she was with her gray eyes like the cold sky. In her dark hair sparkled the diamond coronet like a radiance. He suddenly felt by a kind of intuition, that this grand creature was not merely a being destined to perpetuate the race, but the strange and mysterious product of all our complicated desires, which have been accumulating in us for centuries, but which have been turned aside from their primitive and divine object, and have wandered after a mystic, imperfectly perceived, and intangible beauty. There are some women like that, who blossom only for our dreams, adorned with every poetical attribute of civilization, with that ideal luxury, coquetry, and aesthetic charm which surround woman, a living statue that brightens our life. Her husband remained standing before her, stupefied at his tardy and obscure discovery, confusedly hitting on the cause of his former jealousy, and understanding it all very imperfectly. And at last Lai said, "I believe you, for I feel at this moment that you are not lying, and before I really thought that you were." She put out her hand to him. "We are friends, then?" He took her hand and kissed it and replied, "We are friends. Thank you, Gabrielle." Then he went out, still looking at her, and surprised that she was still so beautiful, and feeling a strange emotion arising in him. End of Useless Beauty by Guy de Maupassant.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Village Uncle, An Imaginary Retrospect by Nathaniel Hawthorne, from his collection of Twice Told Tales. Read by Nicodemus. Come, another log upon the hearth. True, our little parlor is comfortable, especially here, where the old man sits in his old armchair, but on Thanksgiving night the blaze should dance high up the chimney and send a shower of sparks into the outer darkness. Toss on an armful of those dry oak chips, the last relics of the mermaid's knee timbers, the bones of your namesake, Susan. Higher yet and clearer be the blaze, till our cottage windows glow the ruddiest in the village, and the light of our household mirth flash far across the bay to Nahant. And now come, Susan, come, my children, draw your chairs round me, all of you. There is a dimness over your figures. You sit quivering indistinctly with each motion of the blaze, which eddies about you like a flood, so that you all have the look of visions, or people that dwell only in the firelight, and will vanish from existence as completely as your own shadows when the flame shall sink among the embers. Hark! Let me listen for the swell of the surf. It should be audible a mile inland on a night like this. Yes, there I catch the sound, but only an uncertain murmur, as if a good way down over the beach. Though by the almanac it is high tide at 8 o'clock, and the billows must now be dashing within 30 yards of our door. Ah, the old man's ears are failing him, and so is his eyesight, and perhaps his mind, else you would not all be so shadowy in the blaze of this Thanksgiving fire. How strangely the past is peeping over the shoulders of the present. To judge by my recollections, it is but a few moments since I sat in another room. Yonder model of a vessel was not there, and nor the old chest of drawers, nor Susan's profile and mine in that gilt frame. Nothing, in short, except this same fire, which glimmered on books, papers, and a picture, and half discovered my solitary figure in a looking-glass. But it was paler than my rugged old self, and younger, too, by almost half a century. Speak to me, Susan, speak, my beloved ones, for the scene is glimmering on my sight again, and as it brightens, you fade away. Oh, I should be loath to lose my treasure of past happiness, and become once more what I was then, a hermit in the depths of my own mind, sometimes yawning over drowsy volumes, and anon a scribbler of wearier trash than what I read, a man who had wandered out of the real world and got into its shadow, where his troubles, joys, and vicissitudes were of such slight stuff that he hardly knew whether he lived or only dreamed of living. Thank heaven I am an old man now, and have done with all such vanities. Still this dimness of mine eyes. Come nearer, Susan, and stand before the fullest blaze of the hearth. Now I behold you illuminated from head to foot, in your clean cap and decent gown, with a dear lock of grey hair across your forehead, and a quiet smile about your mouth, while the eyes alone are concealed by the red gleam of the fire upon your spectacles. There you made me tremble again. When the flame quivered, my sweet Susan, you quivered with it, and grew indistinct, as if melting into the warm light, that my last glimpse of you might be as visionary as the first was, full many a year since. Do you remember it? You stood on the little bridge over the brook that runs across King's Beach into the sea. It was twilight, the waves rolling in, the wind sweeping by, the crimson clouds fading in the west, and the silver moon brightening above the hill. And on the bridge were you, fluttering in the breeze like a sea-bird that might skim away at your pleasure. You seemed a daughter of the viewless wind, a creature of the ocean foam and the crimson light, whose merry life was spent in dancing on the crests of the billows that threw up their spray to support your footsteps. As I drew nearer, I fancied you akin to the race of mermaids, and thought how pleasant it would be to dwell with you among the quiet coves in the shadow of the cliffs, and to roam along secluded beaches of the purest sand, and when our northern shores grew bleak, to haunt the islands, green and lonely far amid summer seas. And yet it gladdened me, after all this nonsense, to find you nothing but a pretty young girl, sadly perplexed with the rude behavior of the wind about your petticoats. Thus I did with Susan as with most other things in my earlier days, dipping her image into my mind and coloring it of 1,000 fantastic hues, before I could see her as she really was. Now, Susan, for a sober picture of our village. It was a small collection of dwellings that seemed to have been cast up by the sea, with the rockweed and marine plants that it vomits after a storm, or to have come ashore among the pipe staves and the other lumber which had been washed from the deck of an eastern schooner. There was just space for the narrow and sandy street between the beach in front and a precipitous hill that lifted its rocky forehead in the rear, among a waste of juniper bushes and the wild growth of a broken pasture. The village was picturesque in the variety of its edifices, though all were rude. Here stood a little old hovel built perhaps of driftwood, there a row of boat-houses, and beyond them a 2-story dwelling of dark and weather-beaten aspect, the whole intermixed with 1 or 2 snug cottages painted white, a sufficiency of pigsties, and a shoemaker's shop. 2 grocery stores stand opposite each other in the center of the village, These were the places of resort at their idle hours of a hardy throng of fishermen in red baize shirts, oilcloth trousers, and boots of brown leather, covering the whole leg, true 7-league boots, but fitter to wade the ocean than walk the earth. The wearers seemed amphibious, as if they did but creep out of salt water to sun themselves. Nor would it have been wonderful to see their lower limbs covered with clusters of little shellfish, such as cling to rocks and old ship timber over which the tide ebbs and flows. When their fleet of boats was weather-bound, the butchers raised their price, and the spit was busier than the frying-pan. For this was a place of fish, and known as such to all the country round about. The very air was fishy, being perfumed with dead sculpins, hardheads, and dogfish, strewn plentiful on the beach. You see, children, the village is but little changed since your mother and I were young. How like a dream it was, when I bent over a pool of water one pleasant morning, and saw that the ocean had dashed its spray over me and made me a fisherman. There were the tarpauling, the baize shirt, the oilcloth trousers, and 7-league boots, and there my own features, but so reddened with sunburn and sea breezes, that methought I had another face, and on other shoulders too. The seagulls and the loons and I had now all one trade. We skimmed the crested waves, and sought our prey beneath them, the man with as keen enjoyment as the birds. Always when the east grew purple, I launched my dory, my little flat-bottomed skiff, and rowed cross-handed to Point Ledge, the Middle Ledge, or perhaps beyond Egg Rock. Often, too, did I anchor off Dread Ledge, a spot of peril to ships unpiloted, and sometimes spread an adventurous sail and tracked across the bay to South Shore, casting my lines in the sight of Scituate. Ere nightfall I hauled my skiff high and dry on the beach, laden with red-rock cod, or the white-bellied ones of deep water, haddock bearing the black marks of St. Peter's fingers near the gills, the long-bearded hake, whose liver holds enough oil for a midnight lamp, and now and then a mighty halibut, with a back broad as my boat. In the autumn I trolled and caught those lovely fish, the mackerel. When the wind was high, when the whale-boats anchored off the point nodded their slender masts at each other, and the dories pitched and tossed in the surf, when Nahant Beach was thundering 3 miles off, and the spray broke 100 feet in air round the distant base of Egg Rock, when the brimful and boisterous sea threatened to tumble over the street of our village, then I made a holiday on shore. Many such a day did I sit snugly in Mr. Bartlett's store, attentive to the yarns of Uncle Parker, uncle to the whole village by right of seniority, but of southern blood with no kindred in New England. His figure is before me now, enthroned upon a mackerel barrel, a lean old man of great height, but bent with years, and twisted into an uncouth shape by 7 broken limbs, furrowed also and weather-worn, as if every gale for the better part of a century had caught him somewhere on the sea. He looked like a harbinger of tempest, a shipmate of the Flying Dutchman. After innumerable voyages aboard men of war and merchantmen, fishing schooners and tobacco boats, the old salt had become master of a hand-cart, which he daily trundled about the vicinity, and sometimes blew his fish-horn through the streets of Salem. One of Uncle Parker's eyes had been blown out with gunpowder, and the other did but glimmer in its socket. Turning it upward as he spoke, it was his delight to tell of cruises against the French, and battles with his own shipmates, when he and an antagonist used to be seated astride of a sailor's chest, each fastened down by a spike nail through his trousers, and there to fight it out. Sometimes he expatiated on the delicious flavor of the liagden, a greasy and goose-like fowl, which the sailors catch with hook and line on the Grand Banks. He dwelt with rapture on an interminable winter at the Isle of Sables, where he had gladdened himself amid polar snows with the rum and sugar saved from the wreck of a West India schooner, and wrathfully did he shake his fist as he related how a party of Cape Cod men had robbed him and his companions of their lawful spoil, and sailed away with every keg of old Jamaica, leaving him not a drop to drown his sorrow. Villains they were, and of that wicked brotherhood, who are said to tie lanterns to horses' tails, to mislead the mariner along the dangerous shores of the Cape. Even now I seem to see the group of fishermen, with that old salt in the midst. One fellow sits on the counter, a second bestrides an oil barrel, a third lolls at his length on a parcel of new codlines, and another has planted the tarry seat of his trousers on a heap of salt, which will shortly be sprinkled over a lot of fish. They are a likely set of men. Some have voyaged to the East Indies or the Pacific, and most of them have sailed in Marblehead schooners to Newfoundland. A few have been no farther than the Middle Banks, and one or two have always fished along the shore. But as Uncle Parker used to say, they have all been christened in salt water, and know more than men ever learn in the bushes. A curious figure by way of contrast is a fish dealer from Farup country, listening with eyes wide open to narratives that might startle Sinbad the sailor. Be it well with you, my brethren, ye are all gone, some to your graves ashore, and others to the depths of ocean. But my faith is strong that ye are happy, for whenever I behold your forms, whether in dream or vision, each departed friend is puffing his long nine, and the mug of the right black strap goes round from lip to lip. But where was the mermaid in those delightful times? At a certain window near the center of the village appeared a pretty display of gingerbread men and horses, picture books and ballads, small fish hooks, pens, needles, sugar plums, and brass thimbles, articles on which the young fishermen used to expend their money from pure gallantry. What a picture Susan was behind the counter! A slender maiden, though the child of rugged parents, she had the slimmest of all waists, brown hair curling on her neck, and a complexion rather pale, except when the sea breeze flushed it. A few freckles became beauty spots beneath her eyelids. How was it, Susan, that you talked and acted so carelessly, yet always for the best, doing whatever was right in your own eyes, and never once doing wrong in mine, nor shocked a taste that had been morbidly sensitive till now? And whence had you that happiest gift of brightening every topic with an unsought gaiety, quiet but irresistible, so that even gloomy spirits felt your sunshine, and did not shrink from it? Nature wrought the charm. She made you a frank, simple, kind-hearted, sensible, and mirthful girl. Obeying nature, you did free things without indelicacy, displayed a maiden's thoughts to every eye, and proved yourself as innocent as naked Eve. It was beautiful to observe how her simple and happy nature mingled itself with mine. She kindled a domestic fire within my heart, and took up her dwelling there, even in that chill and lonesome cavern hung round with the glittering icicles of fancy. She gave me warmth of feeling, while the influence of my mind made her contemplative. I taught her to love the moonlight hour, when the expanse of the encircled bay was smooth as a great mirror, and slept in a transparent shadow, while beyond Nahant the wind rippled the dim ocean into a dreamy brightness, which grew faint afar off without becoming gloomier. I held her hand and pointed to the long surf wave as it rolled calmly on the beach in an unbroken line of silver. We were silent together till its deep and peaceful murmur had swept by us. When the Sabbath sun shone down into the recesses of the cliffs, I led the mermaid thither, and told her that those huge grey shattered rocks, and her native sea that raged forever like a storm against them, and her own slender beauty, in so stern a scene, were all combined into a strain of poetry. But on the Sabbath eve, when her mother had gone early to bed, and her gentle sister had smiled and left us, as we sat alone by the quiet hearth, with household things around, it was her turn to make me feel that there was a deeper poetry, and that this was the dearest hour of all. Thus went on our wooing, till I had shot wildfowl enough to feather our bridal bed, and the daughter of the sea was mine. I built a cottage for Susan and myself, and made a gateway in the form of a Gothic arch, by setting up a whale's jawbones. We bought a heifer with her first calf, and had a little garden on the hillside to supply us with potatoes and green sauce for our fish. Our parlour, small and neat, was ornamented with our 2 profiles in 1 gilt frame, and with shells and pretty pebbles on the mantelpiece, selected from the sea's treasury of such things on Nahant Beach. On the desk beneath the looking-glass lay the Bible, which I had begun to read aloud at the book of Genesis, and the singing book that Susan used for her evening psalm. Except the almanac, we had no other literature. All that I heard of books was when an Indian history or tale of shipwreck was sold by a peddler or wandering subscription man to someone in the village, and read through its owner's nose to a slumberous auditory. Like my brother fisherman, I grew into the belief that all human erudition was collected in our pedagogue, whose green spectacles and solemn phiz, as he passed to his little schoolhouse amid a waste of sand, might have gained him a diploma from any college in New England. In truth, I dreaded him. When our children were old enough to claim his care, you remember, Susan, how I frowned, though you were pleased, at this learned man's encomiums on their proficiency. I feared to trust them even with the alphabet. It was the key to a fatal treasure. but I love to lead them by their little hands along the beach, and point to nature in the vast and the minute, the sky, the sea, the green earth, the pebbles and the shells. Then did I discourse of the mighty works and coextensive goodness of the Deity, with the simple wisdom of a man whose mind had profited by lonely days upon the deep, and his heart by the strong and pure affections of his evening home. Sometimes my voice lost itself in a tremulous depth, for I felt his eye upon me as I spoke. Once, while my wife and all of us were gazing at ourselves in the mirror left behind the tide in a hollow of the sand, I pointed to the pictured heaven below, and bade her observe how religion was strewn everywhere in our path, since even a casual pool of water recalled the idea of that home whither we were traveling, to rest forever with our children. Suddenly your image, Susan, and all the little faces made up of yours and mine, seemed to fade away and vanish around me, leaving a pale visage like my own of former days within the frame of a large looking-glass. Strange illusion. My life glided on, the past appearing to mingle with the present and absorb the future, till the whole lies before me at a glance. My manhood has long been waning with a stanch decay. My earlier contemporaries, after lives of unbroken health, are all at rest, without having known the weariness of later age. And now, with a wrinkled forehead and thin white hair as badges of my dignity, I have become the patriarch, the uncle of the village. I love that name. It widens the circle of my sympathies. It joins all the youthful to my household in the kindred of affection. Like Uncle Parker, whose rheumatic bones were dashed against Egg Rock full 40 years ago, I am a spinner of long yarns. Seated on the gunwale of a dory, or on the sunny side of a boathouse, where the warmth is grateful to my limbs, or by my own hearth when a friend or two are there, I overflow with talk, and yet am never tedious. With a broken voice I give utterance to such wisdom. Such, heaven be praised, is the vigor of my faculties, that many a forgotten usage and traditions ancient in my youth, and early adventures of myself or others, hitherto effaced by things more recent, acquire new distinctness in my memory. I remember the happy days when the haddock were more numerous on all the fishing grounds than sculpins in the surf, when the deep-water cod swam close inshore, and the dogfish with his poisonous horn had not learned to take the hook. I can number every equinoctial storm in which the sea has overwhelmed the street, flooded the cellars of the village, and hissed upon our kitchen hearth. I give the history of the great whale that was landed on Whale Beach, and whose jaws, being now my gateway, will last for ages after my coffin shall have passed beneath them. Thence it is an easy digression to the halibut, scarcely smaller than the whale, which ran out 6 cod lines and hauled my dory to the mouth of Boston Harbor before I could touch him with the gaff. If melancholy accidents be the theme of conversations, I tell how a friend of mine was taken out of his boat by an enormous shark, and the sad true tale of a young man on the eve of marriage, who had been 9 days missing when his drowned body floated into the very pathway on Marblehead Neck that had often led him to the dwelling of his bride, as if the dripping corpse would have come where the mourner was. With such awful fidelity did that lover return to fulfill his vows. Another favorite story is of a crazy maiden who conversed with angels and had the gift of prophecy, and whom all the village loved and pitied, though she went from door to door accusing us of sin, exhorting to repentance, and foretelling our destruction by flood or earthquake. If the young men boast their knowledge of the ledges and sunken rocks, I speak of pilots who knew the wind by its scent and the wave by its taste, and could have steered blindfold to any port between Boston and Mount Desert, guided only by the rote of the shore, the peculiar sound of the surf on each island, beach, and line of rocks along the coast. Thus do I talk, and all my auditors grow wise, while they deem it pastime. I recollect no happier portion of my life than this, my calm old age. It is like the sunny and sheltered slope of a valley, where late in the autumn the grass is greener than in August, and intermixed with golden dandelions, that have not been seen till now, since the first warmth of the year. But with me, the verdure and the flowers are not frostbitten in the midst of winter. A playfulness has revisited my mind, a sympathy with the young and gay, an unpainful interest in the business of others, a light and wandering curiosity, arising perhaps from the sense that my toil on earth is ended, and the brief hour till bedtime may be spent in play. Still I have fancied that there is a depth of feeling and reflection under this superficial levity, peculiar to one who has lived long and is soon to die. Show me anything that would make an infant smile, and you shall behold a gleam of mirth over the hoary ruin of my visage. I can spend a pleasant hour in the sun, watching the sports of the village children on the edge of the surf. Now they chase the retreating wave far down over the wet sand. Now it steals softly up to kiss their naked feet. Now it comes onward with threatening front and roars after the laughing crew as they scamper beyond its reach. Why should not an old man be merry too, when the great sea is at play with those little children? I delight also to follow in the wake of a pleasure party of young men and girls, strolling along the beach after an early supper at the Point. Here, with handkerchiefs at nose, they bend over a heap of eelgrass, entangled in which is a dead skate, so oddly accoutred with 2 legs and a long tail, that they mistake him for a drowned animal. A few steps farther the ladies scream, and the gentlemen make ready to protect them against the young shark of the dogfish kind, rolling with a lifelike motion in the tide that has thrown him up. Next they are smit with wonder at the black shells of a wagon load of live lobsters, packed in rockweed for the country market. And when they reach the fleet of dories just hauled ashore after the day's fishing, how do I laugh in my sleeve, and sometimes roar outright, at the simplicity of these young folks and the sly humor of the fishermen. In winter, when our village is thrown into a bustle by the arrival of perhaps a score of country dealers, bargaining for frozen fish to be transported hundreds of miles and eaten fresh in Vermont or Canada, I am a pleased but idle spectator in the throng, for I launch my boat no more. When the shore was solitary, I have found a pleasure that seemed even to exalt my mind, in observing the sports or contentions of 2 gulls, as they wheeled and hovered about each other, with hoarse screams, one moment flapping on the foam of the wave, and then soaring aloft till their white bosoms melted into the upper sunshine. In the calm of the summer sunset, I drag my aged limbs with a little ostentation of activity, because I am so old, up to the rocky brow of the hill. There I see the white sails of many a vessel, outward bound or homeward from afar, and the black trail of a vapor behind the eastern steamboat. There, too, is the sun going down, but not in gloom, and there the illimitable ocean mingling with the sky to remind me of eternity. But sweetest of all is the hour of cheerful musing and pleasant talk that comes between the dusk and the lighted candle by my glowing fireside. And never, even on the first Thanksgiving night, when Susan and I sat alone with our hopes, nor the second when a stranger had been sent to gladden us, and be the visible image of our affection, did I feel such joy as now. All that belong to me are here. Death has taken none, nor disease kept them away, nor strife divided them from their parents or each other, with neither poverty nor riches to disturb them, nor the misery of desires beyond their lot. They have kept New England's festival round the patriarch's board, for I am a patriarch. Here I sit among my descendants in my old armchair and a memorial corner, while the firelight throws an appropriate glory round my venerable frame. Susan, my children, something whispers me that this happiest hour must be the final one, and that nothing remains but to bless you all and depart with a treasure of recollected joys to heaven. Will you meet me there? Alas, your figures grow indistinct, fading into pictures on the air, and now to fainter outlines, while the fire is glimmering on the walls of a familiar room, and shows the book that I flung down, and the sheet that I had left half-written some 50 years ago. I lift my eyes to the looking-glass and perceive myself alone, unless those be the mermaid's features, retiring into the depths of the mirror with a tender and melancholy smile. Ah, one feels a chillness, not bodily, but about the heart, and moreover a foolish dread of looking behind him after these pastimes. I can imagine precisely how a magician would sit down in gloom and terror, after dismissing the shadows that had personated dead or distant people, and stripping his cavern of the unreal splendor which had changed it to a palace. And now for a moral to my reverie. Shall it be that since fancy can create so bright a dream of happiness, it were better to dream on from youth to age than to awake and strive doubtfully for something real? Oh, the slight tissue of a dream can no more preserve us from the stern reality of misfortune than a robe of cobweb could repel the wintry blast. Be this the moral, then. And chaste and warm affections, humble wishes, and honest toil for some useful end, there is health for the mind, and quiet for the heart, the prospect of a happy life, and the fairest hope of heaven. End of The Village Uncle by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus.
The Whale and the Grasshopper by Humorous O'Brien. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Whale and the Grasshopper by Humorous O'Brien. From the Illustrated Sunday Magazine. When Standish McNeill started talking to his friend Felix O'Dowd as they walked at a leisurely pace towards the town of Castle Gregory on a June morning, what he said was, "The world is a wonderful place when you come to think about it. An island is a wonderful place, and so is America, and though there are lots of places like each other, there's no place like Ballysantamarillo. When there's not sunshine there, there's moonshine, and the handsomest women in the world live there, and nowhere else except in Ireland or the churchyards could you find such decent people." "Decency," said Felix, "when you're poor is extravagance, and bad example when you're rich." "And why?" said Standish. "Well," said Felix, "because the poor imitate the rich, and the rich give to the poor, and when the poor give to each other, they have nothing of their own." "That's communism you're talking," said Standish, "and that always comes from education and enlightenment. Sure, if the poor weren't dacent, they'd be rich, and if the rich weren't dacent, they'd be poor, and if everyone had a conscience, they'd be less millionaires. 'Tis a poor bird that can't pick for himself." "But suppose a bird had a broken wing and couldn't fly to where the pickings were," said Felix. "Well, then bring the pickings to him. That would be charity." "But charity is decency, and wisdom is holding your tongue when you don't know what you're talking about." "If the people of Ballysantamarillo are so decent, how is it that there are so many bachelors there? Do you think it right to have all the young women worrying their heads of reading trashy novels and doing all sorts of silly things, like fixing their hair in a way that were never intended by nature, and doing so for years and years and having nothing in the end but the trouble of it all?" "Well, 'tis hard blamin' the young men, because every young lady you meet looks better to you than the last until you meet the next, and so you go on to another, until you're so old that no one would marry you at all unless you had lots of money, a bad liver, and a shaky heart. An old man without any sense, lots of money, a bad liver, and a shaken heart can always get a young lady to marry him," said Felix, "though rheumatics, gout, and a wooden leg are just as good in such a case." "Every bit," said Standish, "but there's nothing like a weak constitution, a cold climate, and a tendency to pneumonia." "Old men are queer," said Felix. "They are," said Standish, "and if they were all only half as wise as they think they are, then they'd be only young fools in the world. I don't wonder a bit at the suffragettes. And a time will come when we won't know men from women, unless someone tells us so. Wish 'tis my belief that there will be a great reaction some day, because women will never be able to stand the strain of doing what they please without encountering opposition. When a man falls in love, he falls into trouble likewise, and when a woman isn't in trouble, you may be sure that there's something wrong with her." "Well," said Standish, "I think we will leave the women where the devil left St. Peter." "Where was that?" asked Felix. "Alone, answered Standish. That would be all very fine if they stayed there, said Felix. Now, said Standish, as I was talking of me travels in foreign parts, I want to tell you about the morning I walked along the beach at Ballysanta'Mallow, and a warm morning it was, too. So I says to meself, Standish McNeil, says I, what kind of fool of a man are you? Why don't you take a swim for yourself? So I did take a swim, and I swam to the rocks where the seals go to get their photographs taken, and while I was having a rest for meself, I noticed a grasshopper sitting a short distance away, and upon me word, but he was the most sorrowful looking grasshopper I ever saw before or since. Then all of a sudden a monster whale comes up from the sea, and lies down beside him and says, well, says he, is that you? Who'd ever think of finding you here? Why, there's nothing strange under the sun but the ways of women. 'Tis me that's here, then, said the grasshopper. Me grandmother died last night, and she wasn't insured either. The practice of negligence is the curse of mankind and the root of sorrow, says the whale. I suppose the poor old soul had her fill of days, and sure we all must die, and 'tis cheaper to be dead than alive at any time. A man never knows that he's dead when he's dead, and he never knows he's alive until he's married. You're a great one to expatiate on things you know nothing about, like the barbers and the cobblers, said the grasshopper. I only want to know if you're coming to the funeral tomorrow. I'm sorry I can't, says the whale. My grandfather is getting married for the 10th time, and as I was in China on the last few occasions, I must pay me respects by being present at tomorrow's festivities, says he. I'm sorry you can't come, says the grasshopper, because you are heartily welcome, and you'd add prestige to the ceremony besides. I know that, says the whale, but America doesn't care much about ceremony. Who told you that? Says the grasshopper. Haven't I me eyesight, and don't I read the newspapers? Says the whale. You mustn't read the society columns then, says the grasshopper. Wisha, for the love of St. Crispin, says the whale. Have they society columns in the American newspapers? Indeed they have, says the grasshopper, and they oftentimes devote a few columns to other matters when the dressmakers don't be busy. America is a strange country surely, a wonderful country, not to say a word about the length and breadth of it. I swam round it twice last week without stopping, to try and reduce me weight, and would you believe me that I was tired after the journey, but the change of air only added to me proportions. That's too bad, said the grasshopper. Are you an American? Said the whale. Of course I am, says the grasshopper. You don't think 'tis the way I'd be born at sea, and no nationality at all like yourself. I'm proud of me country. And why, might I ask? Well, don't we produce distinguished Irishmen? Don't we make Americans of the Europeans, and Europeans of the Americans? Think of all the connoisseurs who wouldn't buy a work of art in their own country, when they could go to Europe and pay 10 times its value for the pot boilers that does be turned out in the studios of Paris and London. There's nothing like home industry, says the whale, in a foreign country, I mean. After all, who knows anything about a work of art but the artist? And very little he knows about it either. A work of art is like a flower. It grows, it happens, that's all, and unless you charge the devil's own price for it, people will think you are cheating them. Wisha, I suppose the best anyone can do is to take all you can get, and if you want to be a philanthropist, give away what you don't want, says the grasshopper. All worth missing I catches, says the Whale, "and all worth catchin', I misses, like the fisherwoman who missed the fish, and caught a crab. How's things in Europe? I didn't see the papers this morning." "Europe is in a bad way," says the Grasshopper. "She was preaching civilizations for centuries so that she might be prepared when war came to annihilate herself." "It looks that way to me," says the Whale. "Is there anything else worth while going on in the world?" "There's the Irish question," says the Grasshopper. "Where's that island is?" says the Whale. "Isn't that an island to the west of England?" "No," says the Grasshopper, "but England is an island to the east of Ireland." Wisha, sees the Whale. "It gives me indigestion to hear people talking about Ireland. Sure, I nearly swallowed it up, be mistake, while I was on holiday in the Atlantic last year, and I'm sorry now that I didn't." "And I'm sorry that you didn't try," says the Grasshopper. "Then you'd know something about indigestion. The less you have to say about Ireland, the less you'll have to worry for. Remember that me father came from Cork." "Can't I say what I like?" says the Whale. "You can think what you like," says the Grasshopper, "but say what other people like if you want to be a good politician." "There's nothing so much abused as politics," says the Whale. "Except politicians," says the Grasshopper. "Only for the Irish there'd be no one bothering about poetry and the drama today. Only for fools there'd be no wise people, and only for sprats, hag, and mackerel there, you'd be no whales, and a good job that would be too." "What's that you're saying?" says the Whale very sharply. "Don't have me to lose my temper with you," says the Grasshopper. "Wish a bad luck to your impudence and bad manners, you insignificant little spalpeen." "How dare you insult your superiors?" says the Whale. "Who's me superior?" says the Grasshopper. "You, is it?" "Yes, me then," says the Whale. "Another word from you," says the Whale, "and I'll put you where Napoleon put the oysters." "Well," says the Grasshopper, "there's no doubt but vanity, ignorance, and ambition are three wonderful things, and you have them all. Neither you nor Napoleon, nor the Kaiser himself and his 100 million men could do hurt harm to me. You could have every soldier in the German army, the French army, and the Salvation Army looking for me, and I'd put the Kamatha on them all." "I can't stand this any longer," says the Whale, and then and there he hits the rock a whack of his tail, and when I went to look for the Grasshopper, there he was sitting on the Whale's nose, as happy and contented as if nothing happened. And when he jumped back to the rock again, he says, "A little exercise, with 'tis tempered and discretion, never does any harm, but violent exertion is a very foolish thing if you value your health. But it is only people who have no sense, but think they have it all, who make such errors." "If I could get a hold of you," says the Whale, "I'd knock some of the pride out of you." "That would be an ungentlemanly way of displaying your displeasure," says the Grasshopper. "I'd scorn," says he, "to use violent means with you, or do you physical injury of any kind. All you want is self-control and a little education. You should know that quantity without quality isn't as good as quality without quantity." "Sure 'tis I'm the fool to be wasting me time listening to the likes of you," says the Whale. "If any of me family saw me now, I'd never hear the end of it." "Indeed," says the Grasshopper, "no one belonging to me would ever recognize me ever again if they thought I was trying to make a whale behave himself. There would be some excuse for one of my attainments, feeling proud, but as for you—" "And what in the name of nonsense can you do except give old guff out of you?" "I haven't time to tell you all," says the Grasshopper, "but to commence with, I can travel all over the world and have the use of trains, steamers, sailing ships and automobiles, and will never be asked to pay a cent. And I can live on dry land all me life if I choose, while you can't live under water, or over water, on land or on sea, and while all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't catch me if they were trying till the crack of doom, you would be caught by a few poor, harmless sailors, who couldn't know a crow from a cormorant, and who'd sell your carcass to make oil for foolish wives to burn, and write letters to other people's husbands, and fill the world with trouble. And what about all the whalebone we supplies for ladies' corsets and paper knives? And what about all the stories we make for the novelists and the moving pictures? And we're at the sprig of holly now, said Felix. Is it a pint porter or a bottle you'll have? I'll have a pint, I think, said Standish. End of story.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Winning of Lucinda by L.M. Montgomery. Read by Mindy. The marriage of a Penhallow was always the signal for a gathering of the Penhallows. From the uttermost parts of the earth they would come. Penhallows by birth, and Penhallows by marriage, and Penhallows by ancestry. East Grafton was the ancient habitat of the race, and Penhallow Grange, where old John Penhallow lived, was a Mecca to them. As for the family itself, the exact kinship of all its various branches and ramifications was a hard thing to define. Old Uncle Julius Penhallow was looked upon as a veritable wonder, because he carried it all in his head, and could tell on sight just what relation any one Penhallow was to any other Penhallow. The rest made a blind guess at it, for the most part, and the younger Penhallows let it go at loose cousinship. In this instance it was Alice Penhallow, daughter of young John Penhallow, who was to be married. Alice was a nice girl, but she and her wedding will only pertain to this story in so far as they furnish a background for Lucinda. Hence, nothing more need be said of her. On the afternoon of her wedding day, the Penhallows held to the good old-fashioned custom of evening weddings, with a rousing dance afterwards. Penhallow Grange was filled to overflowing with guests who had come there to have tea and rest themselves before going down to young John's. Many of them had driven 50 miles. In the big autumnal orchard the younger fry foregathered and chatted and coquetted. Upstairs in old Mrs. John's bedroom, she and her married daughters held high conclave. Old John had established himself with his sons and sons-in-law in the parlor, and the 3 daughters-in-law were making themselves at home in the blue sitting-room, ear-deep in harmless family gossip. Lucinda and Romney Penhallow were also there. Thin Mrs. Nathaniel Penhallow, who sat in a rocking-chair and toasted her toes at the grate, for the brilliant autumn afternoon was slightly chilly, and Lucinda, as usual, had the window open. She and plump Mrs. Frederick Penhallow did most of the talking, Mrs. George Penhallow being rather out of it by reason of her newness. She was George Penhallow's second wife, married only a year. Hence her contributions to the conversation were rather spasmodic, hurled in, as it were, by dead reckoning, being sometimes appropriate, and sometimes savouring of a point of view not strictly Penhallow-esque. Romney Penhallow was sitting in a corner, listening to the chatter of the women, with the inscrutable smile that always vexed Mrs. Frederick. Mrs. George wondered within herself what he did there among the women. She also wondered just where he belonged on the family tree. He was not one of the uncles, yet he could not be much younger than George. 40 if he is a day, was Mrs. George's mental dictum, but a very handsome and fascinating man. I never saw such a splendid chin and dimple." Lucinda, with bronze-colored hair and the whitest of skins, defiant of merciless sunlight and revelling in the crisp air, sat on the sill of the open window behind the crimson vine leaves, looking out into the garden, where dahlias flamed and asters broke into waves of purple and snow. The ruddy light of the autumn afternoon gave a sheen to the waves of her hair, and brought out the exceeding purity of her Greek outlines. Mrs. George knew who Lucinda was, a cousin of the second generation, and, in spite of her 35 years, the acknowledged beauty of the whole Penhallow connection. She was one of those rare women who keep their loveliness unmarred by the passage of years. She had ripened and matured, but she had not grown old. The older Penhallows were still inclined, from sheer force of habit, to look upon her as a girl, and the younger Penhallows hailed her as one of themselves. Yet Lucinda never aped girlishness. Good taste and a strong sense of humour preserved her amid many temptations thereto. She was simply a beautiful, fully developed woman, with whom time had declared a truce, young with a mellow youth which had nothing to do with years. Mrs. George liked and admired Lucinda. Now, when Mrs. George liked and admired any person, it was a matter of necessity with her to impart her opinions to the most convenient confidant. In this case, it was Romney Penhallow to whom Mrs. George remarked sweetly, "Really, don't you think our Lucinda's looking remarkably well this fall?" It seemed a very harmless, inane, well-meant question, but poor Mrs. George might be well excused for feeling bewildered over the effect. Romney gathered his long legs together, stood up, and swept the unfortunate speaker a crushing Penhallow bow of state. "Far be it from me to disagree with the opinion of a lady, especially when it concerns another lady," he said, as he left the blue room. Overcome by the mordant satire in his tone, Mrs. George glanced speechlessly at Lucinda. Behold, Lucinda had squarely turned her back on the party, and was gazing out into the garden, with a very decided flush on the snowy curves of her neck and cheek. Then Mrs. George looked at her sisters-in-law. They were regarding her with the tolerant amusement they might bestow on a blundering child. Mrs. George experienced that subtle prescience whereby it is given us to know that we have put our foot in it. She felt herself turning an uncomfortable brick red. What Penhallow skeleton had she unwittingly jangled? Why, oh why, was it such an evident breach of proprieties to praise Lucinda? Mrs. George was devoutly thankful that a summons to the tea-table rescued her from her mire of embarrassment. The meal was spoiled for her, however. The mortifying recollection of her mysterious blunder conspired with her curiosity to banish appetite. As soon as possible after tea, she decoyed Mrs. Frederick out into the garden, and in the Delilah walk solemnly demanded the reason for it. Mrs. Frederick indulged in a laugh which put the metal on her festal brown silk seams to the test. "My dear Cecilia, it was so amusing," she said, a little patronizingly. "But why?" cried Mrs. George, resenting the patronage and the mystery. "What was so dreadful in what I said, or so funny? And who is this Romney Penhallow who mustn't be spoken to?" "Oh, Romney's one of the Charlottetown Penhallows," explained Mrs. Frederick. "He is a lawyer there. He is a first cousin of Lucinda's, and a second of George's. Or is he? Oh, bother! You must go to Uncle James if you want the genealogy. I'm in a chronic muddle concerning Penhallow relationship. As for Romney, of course you can speak to him about anything you like, except Lucinda. Oh, you innocent! To ask him if he didn't think Lucinda was looking well, and right before her, too. Of course he thought you did it on purpose to tease him, and that was what made him so savage and sarcastic." "But why?" persisted Mrs. George, sticking tenaciously to her point. "Hasn't George told you?" "No," said George's wife in mild exasperation. "George has spent most of his time since we were married telling me odd things about the Penhallows, but he hasn't got to that yet, evidently." "Why, my dear, it is our family romance. Lucinda and Romney are in love with each other. They've been in love with each other for 15 years, and in all that time they've never spoken to each other once." "Dear me," murmured Mrs. George, feeling the inadequacy of mere language. Was this a Penhallow method of courtship? "But why?" "They had a quarrel 15 years ago," said Mrs. Frederick patiently. "Nobody knows how it originated, or anything about it except that Lucinda was in the wrong. We know that because Lucinda herself admitted it to us afterwards. But in the first flush of her rage, she told Romney that she would never speak to him again as long as she lived. And he said that he would never speak to her until she spoke first, because, you see, as she was in the wrong, she ought to make the first advance. And they never have spoken. Everybody in the connection, I suppose, has taken turns trying to reconcile them, but nobody has succeeded. I don't believe that Romney has ever so much as thought of any other woman in his whole life, and certainly Lucinda has never thought of any other man. You will notice she still wears Romney's ring. They're practically engaged still, of course. And Romney said once that if Lucinda would just say one word, no matter what it was, even if it were something insulting, he would speak too, and beg her pardon for his share in the quarrel, because then, you see, he would not be breaking his word. He hasn't referred to the matter for years, but I presume that he's of the same mind still, and they are just as much in love with each other as they ever were. He's always hanging about where she is, when other people are there too, that is. He avoids her like a plague when she is alone. That is why he stuck out in the blue room with us today. There doesn't seem to be a particle of resentment between them. If Lucinda would only speak! But that Lucinda will not do. "Don't you think she will yet?" said Mrs. George. Mrs. Frederick shook her crimped head sagely. "Not now. The whole thing has hardened too long. Her pride will never let her speak. We used to hope she would be tricked into it by forgetfulness or accident. We used to lay traps for her, but all to no effect. It is such a shame, too. They were made for each other. Do you know, I get cross when I begin to thrash the whole silly affair over like this. Doesn't it sound as if we were talking of the quarrel of two school children? Of late years we have learned that it does not do to speak of Lucinda to Romney, even in the most commonplace way. He seems to resent it." "He ought to speak," cried Mrs. George warmly. "Even if she were in the wrong 10 times over, he ought to overlook it and speak first. But he won't, and she won't. You never saw two such determined mortals. They get it from their grandfather on the mother's side, old Absalom Gordon. There is no such stubbornness on the Penhallow side. His obstinacy was a proverb, my dear, actually a proverb. Whatever he said he would stick to if the skies fell. He was a terrible old man to swear, too," added Mrs. Frederick, dropping into irrelevant reminiscence. "He spent a long time in a mining camp in his younger days, and he never got over it. The habit of swearing, I mean. It would have made your blood run cold, my dear, to have heard him go on at times. And yet he was a real good old man in every other way. He couldn't help it somehow. He tried to, but he used to say that profanity came as natural to him as breathing. It used to mortify his family terribly. Fortunately, none of them took after him in that respect. But he's dead, and one shouldn't speak ill of the dead. I must go and get Mattie Penhallow to do my hair. I would burst these sleeves clean out if I tried to do it myself, and I don't want to dress over again. You won't be likely to talk to Romney about Lucinda again, my dear Cecilia?" 15 years, murmured Mrs. George helplessly to the dahlias. Engaged for 15 years, and never speaking to each other. Dear heart and soul, think of it! Oh, these Penhallows! Meanwhile, Lucinda, serenely unconscious that her love story was being mouthed over by Mrs. Frederick in the dahlia garden, was dressing for the wedding. Lucinda still enjoyed dressing for a festivity, since the mirror still dealt gently with her. Moreover, she had a new dress. Now, a new dress, and especially one as nice as this, was a rarity with Lucinda, who belonged to a branch of the Penhallows noted for being chronically hard up. Indeed, Lucinda and her widowed mother were positively poor, and hence an uncle had given her this one, a beautiful, perishable thing, such as Lucinda never would have dared to choose for herself, but in which she revelled with feminine delight. It was of pale green voile, a colour which brought out admirably the ruddy gloss of her hair and the clear brilliance of her skin. When she had finished dressing, she looked at herself in the mirror with frank delight. Lucinda was not vain, but she was quite well aware of the fact of her beauty, and took an impersonal pleasure in it, as if she were looking at some finely painted picture by a master hand. The form and face reflected in the glass satisfied her. The puffs and draperies of the green voile displayed to perfection the full, but not over-full, curves of her fine figure. Lucinda lifted her arm and touched a red rose to her lips with the hand upon which shone the frosty glitter of Romney's diamond. Looking at the graceful slope of her shoulder and the splendid line of chin and throat with critical approval. She noted, too, how well the gown became her eyes, bringing out all the deeper colour in them. Lucinda had magnificent eyes. Once Romney had written a sonnet to them, in which he compared their colour to ripe blueberries. This may not sound poetical to you, unless you know or remember just what the tints of ripe blueberries are. Dusky purple in some lights, clear slate in others, and yet again in others the misty hue of early meadow violets. "You really look very well," remarked the real Lucinda to the mirrored Lucinda. "Nobody would think you were an old maid, but you are. Alice Penhallow, who is to be married tonight, was a child of 5 when you thought of being married 15 years ago. That makes you an old maid, my dear. Well, it is your own fault, and it will continue to be your own fault, you stubborn offshoot of a stubborn breed." She flung her train out straight and pulled on her gloves. "I do hope I won't get any spots on this dress tonight," she reflected. "It will have to do me for a gala dress for a year at least, and I have a creepy conviction that it is fearfully spottable. Bless Uncle Mark's good, uncalculating heart! How I would have detested it if he had given me something sensible and useful and ugly, as Aunt Amelia would have done." They all went to young John Penhallow's at early moonrise. Lucinda drove over the 2 miles of hill and dale with a youthful second cousin, by name Carrie Penhallow. The wedding was quite a brilliant affair. Lucinda seemed to pervade the social atmosphere, and everywhere she went a little ripple of admiration trailed after her like a wave. She was undeniably a belle. Yet she found herself feeling faintly bored, and was rather glad than otherwise when the guests began to fray off. "I'm afraid I'm losing my capacity for enjoyment," she thought a little drearily. "Yes, I must be growing old. That is what it means when social functions begin to bore you." It was that unlucky Mrs. George who blundered again. She was standing on the veranda when Carrie Penhallow dashed up. "Tell Lucinda that I can't take her back to the Grange. I have to drive Mark and Cissy Penhallow to Bright River to catch the 2 o'clock express. There will be plenty of chances for her with the others." At this moment George Penhallow, holding his rearing horse with difficulty, shouted for his wife. Mrs. George, all in a flurry, dashed back into the still crowded hall. Exactly to whom she gave her message was never known to any of the Penhallows, but a tall, ruddy-haired girl, dressed in pale green organdy, Anne Shirley from Avonlea, told Marilla Cuthbert and Rachel Lynde as a joke the next morning how a chubby little woman in a bright pink fascinator had clutched her by the arm and gasped out, "Carrie Penhallow can't take you. He says you're to look out for someone else," and was gone before she could answer or turn around. Thus it was that Lucinda, when she came out to the veranda step, found herself unaccountably deserted. All the Grange Penhallows were gone. Lucinda realized this after a few moments of bewildered seeking, and she understood that if she were to get to the Grange that night, she must walk. Plainly, there was nobody to take her. Lucinda was angry. It is not pleasant to find yourself forgotten and neglected. It is still less pleasant to walk home alone along a country road at 1 o'clock in the morning, wearing a pale green voile. Lucinda was not prepared for such a walk. She had nothing on her feet save thin-soled shoes, and her only wraps were a flimsy fascinator and short coat. "What a guy I shall look stalking home alone in this rig," she thought crossly. There was no help for it unless she confessed her plight to some of the stranger guests and begged a ride home. Lucinda's pride scorned such a request and the admission of neglect it involved. No, she would walk, since that was all there was to it. But she would not go by the main road to be stared at by all and sundry who might pass her. There was a short-cut by way of a lane across the fields. She knew every inch of it, although she had not traversed it for years. She gathered up the green voile as trimly as possible, slipped around the house, and in the kindly shadows picked her way across the side lawn, and found a gate which opened into a birch-bordered lane where the frosted trees shone with silvery golden radiance in the moonlight. Lucinda flitted down the lane, growing angrier at every step as the realization of how shamefully she seemed to have been treated came home to her. She believed that nobody had thought about her at all, which was tenfold worse than premeditated neglect. As she came to the gate at the lower end of the lane, a man who was leaning over it started with a quick intake of his breath, which, in any other man than Romney Penhallow, or for any other woman than Lucinda Penhallow, would have been an exclamation of surprise. Lucinda recognized him with a great deal of annoyance and a little relief. She would not have to walk home alone. But with Romney Penhallow? Would he think she had contrived it so purposefully? Romney silently opened the gate for her, silently latched it behind her, and silently fell into step beside her. Down across a velvety sweep of field they went. The air was frosty, calm, and still. Over the world lay a haze of moonshine and mist that converted East Grafton's prosaic hills and fields into a shimmering fairyland. At first Lucinda felt angrier than ever. What a ridiculous situation! How the Penhallows would laugh over it! As for Romney, he too was angry with the trick impish chance had played him. He liked being the butt of an awkward situation as little as most men, and certainly to be obliged to walk home over moonlit fields at 1 o'clock in the morning with the woman he had loved and never spoken to for 15 years was the irony of fate with a vengeance. Would she think he had schemed for it? And how the deuce did she come to be walking home from the wedding at all? By the time they had crossed the field and reached the wild cherry lane beyond it, Lucinda's anger was mastered by her saving sense of humor. She was even smiling a little maliciously under her fascinator. The lane was a place of enchantment, a long moonlit colonnade adown which beguiling wood nymphs might have footed it featly. The moonshine fell through the arcing boughs and made a mosaic of silver light and clear-cut shadow for the unfriendly lovers to walk in. On either side was the hovering gloom of the woods, and around them a great silence, unstirred by wind or murmur. Midway in the lane, Lucinda was attacked by a sentimental recollection. She thought of the last time Romney and she had walked home together through this very lane from a party at young John's. It had been moonlight then, too, and Lucinda checked a sigh. They had walked hand in hand. Just here, by the big grey beach, he had stopped her and kissed her. Lucinda wondered if he were thinking of it too, and stole a look at him from under the lace border of her fascinator. But he was striding moodily along with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled down over his eyes, passing the old beach without a glance at it. Lucinda checked another sigh, gathered up an escarped flutter of voile, and marched on. Past the lane, a range of 3 silvery harvest fields sloped down to Peter Penhallow's brook, a wide, shallow stream bridged over in the olden days by the mossy trunk of an ancient fallen tree. When Lucinda and Romney arrived at the brook, they gazed at the brawling water blankly. Lucinda remembered that she must not speak to Romney just in time to prevent an exclamation of dismay. There was no tree. There was no bridge of any kind over the brook. Here was a predicament. But before Lucinda could do more than despairingly ask herself what was to be done, now Romney answered, not in words, but in deeds. He coolly picked Lucinda up in his arms as if she'd been a child instead of a full-grown woman of no mean avoirdupois, and began to wade with her through the water. Lucinda gasped helplessly. She could not forbid him, and she was so choked with rage over his presumption that she could not have spoken in any case. Then came the catastrophe. Romney's foot slipped on a treacherous round stone. There was a tremendous splash, and Romney and Lucinda Penhallow were sitting down in the middle of Peter Penhallow's brook. Lucinda was the first to regain her feet. About her clung, in heart-breaking limpness, the ruined voile. The remembrance of all her wrongs that night rushed over her soul, and her eyes blazed in the moonlight. Lucinda Penhallow had never been so angry in her life. "You damned idiot!" she said, in a voice that literally shook with rage. Romney meekly scrambled up the bank after her. "I'm awful sorry, Lucinda," he said, striving with uncertain success to keep a suspicious quiver of laughter out of his tone. It was wretchedly clumsy of me, but that pebble turned right under my foot. Please forgive me for that, and for other things." Lucinda deigned no answer. She stood on a flat stone and wrung the water from the poor green voile. Romney surveyed her apprehensively. "Hurry, Lucinda," he entreated. "You will catch your death of cold." "I never take cold," answered Lucinda with chattering teeth. "And it is my dress I am thinking of. Was thinking of. You have more need to hurry. You are sopping wet yourself, and you know you are subject to colds. There, come." Lucinda picked up the stringy train, which had been so brave and buoyant 5 minutes before, and started up the field at a brisk rate. Romney came up to her and slipped his arm through hers in the old way. For a time they walked along in silence. Then Lucinda began to shake with inward laughter. She laughed silently for the whole length of the field, and at the line fence between Peter Penhallow's land and the Grange acres she paused, threw back the fascinator from her face, and looked at Romney defiantly. "You are thinking of that," she cried, "and I am thinking of it, and we will go on thinking of it at intervals for the rest of our lives. But if you ever mention it to me, I'll never forgive you, Romney Penhallow." "I never will," promised Romney. There was more than a suspicion of laughter in his voice this time, but Lucinda did not choose to resent it. She did not speak again until they reached the Grange gate. Then she faced him solemnly. "It was a case of atavism," she said. "Old Grandfather Gordon was to blame for it." At the Grange almost everybody was in bed. What with the guests straggling home at intervals and hurrying sleepily off to their rooms, nobody had missed Lucinda, each set supposing she was with some other set. Mrs. Frederick, Mrs. Nathaniel, and Mrs. George alone were up. The perennially chilly Mrs. Nathaniel had kindled a fire of chips in the blue-room grate to warm her feet before retiring, and the three women were discussing the wedding in subdued tones when the door opened and the stately form of Lucinda, stately even in the draggled voile, appeared, and with the damp Romney behind her. "Lucinda Penhallow!" gasped they, one and all. "I was left to walk home," said Lucinda coolly. "So Romney and I came across the fields. There was no bridge over the brook, and when he was carrying me over, he slipped and we fell in. That is all. No, Cecilia, I never take cold, so don't worry. Yes, my dress is ruined, but that is of no consequence. No, thank you, Cecilia. I do not care for a hot drink. Romney, do go and take off those wet clothes of yours immediately. No, Cecilia, I will not take a hot foot-bath. I am going straight to bed. Good night." When the door closed on the pair, the three sisters-in-law stared at each other. Mrs. Frederick, feeling herself incapable of expressing her sensations originally, took refuge in a quote. "Do I sleep? Do I dream? Do I wonder and doubt? Is things what they seem, or is visions about?" "There will be another Penhallow wedding soon," said Mrs. Nathaniel with a long breath. "Lucinda has spoken to Romney at last." "Oh, what do you suppose she said to him?" cried Mrs. George. "My dear Cecilia," said Mrs. Frederick, "we shall never know." They never did know. End of The Winning of Lucinda by L.M. Montgomery.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Wogglebug Book by L. Frank Baum. The Unique Adventures of the Wogglebug. One day Mr. H.M. Wogglebug, T.E., becoming separated from his comrades who had accompanied him from the land of Oz, and finding that time hung heavy on his hands, he had 4 of them, decided to walk down the main street of the city and try to discover something or other of interest. The initials H.M. before his name meant highly magnified, for this Wogglebug was several thousand times bigger than any other Wogglebug you ever saw, and the initials T.E. after his name meant thoroughly educated, and so he was in the land of Oz. But his education, being applied to a Wogglebug intellect, was not at all remarkable in this country, where everything is quite different than Oz. Yet the Wogglebug did not suspect this, and being, like so many other thoroughly educated persons, proud of his mental attainments, he marched along the street with an air of importance that made one wonder what great thoughts were occupying his massive brain. Being about as big in his magnified state as a man, the Wogglebug took care to clothe himself like a man. Only, instead of choosing sober colors for his garments, he delighted in the most gorgeous reds and yellows and blues and greens, so that if you looked at him long, the brilliance of his clothing was liable to dazzle your eyes. I suppose the Wogglebug did not realize at all what a queer appearance he made. Being rather nervous, he seldom looked into a mirror, and as the people he met avoided telling him he was unusual, he had fallen into the habit of considering himself merely an ordinary citizen of the big city wherein he resided. So the Wogglebug strutted proudly along the street, swinging a cane in one hand, flourishing a pink handkerchief in the other, fumbling his watch fob with another, and feeling his necktie was straight with another. Having 4 hands to use would prove rather puzzling to you or me, I imagine, but the Wogglebug was thoroughly accustomed to them. Presently he came to a very fine store with big plate-glass windows, and standing in the center of the biggest window was a creature so beautiful and radiant and altogether charming that the first glance at her nearly took his breath away. Her complexion was lovely, for it was wax, but the thing which really caught the Wogglebug's fancy was the marvelous dress she wore. Indeed, it was the latest, last year's, Paris model, although the Wogglebug did not know that. And the designer must have had a real woggly love for bright colors, for the gown was made of red cloth covered with big checks which were so loud the fashion books called them Wagnerian plaids. Never had our friend the Wogglebug seen such a beautiful gown before, and it afflicted him so strongly that he straightway fell in love with the entire outfit, even to the wax-complexioned lady herself. Very politely he tipped his hat to her, but she stared coldly back without in any way acknowledging the courtesy. "Never mind," he thought. "Faint heart never won fair lady, and I'm determined to win this kaleidoscope of beauty or perish in the attempt." You will notice that our insect had a way of using big words to express himself, which leads us to suspect that the school system in Oz is the same that they employ in Boston. As with swelling heart the Wogglebug feasted his eyes upon the enchanting vision, a small green tag that was attached to a button of the waist suddenly attracted his attention. Upon the tag was marked, "Price $7.93, greatly reduced." "Ah," murmured the Wogglebug, "my darling is in greatly reduced circumstances, and $7.93 will make her mine. Where, oh where shall I find the $7.93 therewith to liberate this divinity and make her Mrs. Wogglebug?" "Move on," said a gruff policeman, who came along swinging his club, and the Wogglebug obediently moved on, his brain working fast and furious in the endeavor to find a way to procure $7.93. You see, in the land of Oz, they used no money at all, so that when the Woggle Bug arrived in America he did not possess a single penny, and no one had presented him with any money since. Yet there must be several ways to procure money in this country, he reflected, for otherwise everybody would be as penniless as I am. But how, I wonder, do they manage to get it? Just then he came along a side street where a number of men were at work digging a long and deep ditch in which to lay a new sewer. Now these men, thought the Woggle Bug, must get money for shoveling all that earth, else they wouldn't do it. Here is my chance to win the charming vision of beauty in the shop window. Seeking out the foreman, he asked for work, and the foreman agreed to hire him. "How much do you pay these workmen?" asked the highly magnified one. $2 a day, answered the foreman. "Then," said the Woggle Bug, "you must pay me $4 a day, for I have 4 arms to their 2 and can do double their work." "If that is so, I'll pay you $4, agreed the man. The Woggle Bug was delighted. In 2 days, he told himself, as he threw off his brilliant coat and placed his hat upon it and rolled up his sleeves, in 2 days I can earn $8, enough to purchase my greatly reduced darling and buy her 7 cents worth of caramels besides. He seized 2 spades and began working so rapidly with his 4 arms that the foreman said, "You must have been forewarned." "Why?" asked the insect. "Because there's a saying that to be forewarned is to be forearmed." "Ha ha ha!" replied the other. "That is nonsense," said the Woggle Bug, digging with all his might, "for they call you the foreman, and yet I only see one of you." "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed the man, and he was so proud of his new worker that he went into the corner saloon to tell his friend the barkeeper what a treasure he had found. It was just after noon that the Woggle Bug hired as a ditch digger in order to win his heart's desire. So at noon on the second day he quit work, and having received 8 silver dollars, he put on his coat and rushed away to the store that he might purchase his intended bride. But, alas for the uncertainty of all our hopes! Just as the Woggle Bug reached the door, he saw a lady coming out of the store dressed in identical checks with which he had fallen in love. At first he did not know what to do or say, for the young lady's complexion was not wax, far from it, but a glance into the window showed him the wax lady now dressed in a plain black tailor-made suit, and at once he knew the wearer of the Wagnerian plaids was his real love, and not the stiff creature behind the glass. "Beg pardon," he exclaimed, stopping the young lady, "but you're mine. Here's the $7.93 and 7 cents for candy." But she glanced at him in a haughty manner, and walked away with her nose slightly elevated. He followed. He could not do otherwise with those delightful checks shining before him like beacon lights to urge him on. The young lady stepped into a car, which whirled away rapidly. For a moment he was nearly paralyzed at his loss. Then he started after the car, as fast as he could go, and this was very fast indeed, he being a Woggle Bug. Somebody cried, "Stop, thief!" and a policeman ran out to arrest him. But the Woggle Bug used his 4 hands to push the officer aside, and the astonished man went rolling into the gutter so recklessly that his uniform bore marks of the encounter for many days. Still keeping an eye on the car, the Woggle Bug rushed on. He frightened 2 dogs, upset a fat gentleman who was crossing the street, leaped over an automobile that shot in front of him, and finally ran plump into the car, which had abruptly stopped to let off a passenger. Breathing hard from his exertions, he jumped upon the rear platform of the car, only to see his charmer step off at the front and walk mincingly up the steps of a house. Despite his fatigue, he flew after her at once, crying out, "Stop, my variegated dear, stop! Don't you know you're mine?" But she slammed the door in his face, and he sat down upon the steps, and wiped his forehead with his pink handkerchief, and fanned himself with his hat, and tried to think what he should do next. Presently a very angry man came out of the house. He had a revolver in one hand and a carving knife in the other. "What do you mean by insulting my wife?" he demanded. "Was that your wife?" asked the Woggle Bug in meek astonishment. "Of course it is my wife," answered the man. "Oh, I didn't know," said the insect, rather humbled. "But I'll give you $7.93 for her. That's all she's worth, you know, for I saw it marked on the tag." The man gave a roar of rage and jumped into the air with the intention of falling on the Woggle Bug and hurting him with the knife and pistol. But the Woggle Bug was suddenly in a hurry and didn't wait to be jumped on. Indeed, he ran so very fast that the man was content to let him go, especially as the pistol wasn't loaded, and the carving knife was as dull as such knives usually are. But his wife had conceived a great dislike for the Wagnerian check costume that had won for her the Woggle Bug's admiration. "I'll never wear it again," she said to her husband when he came in and told her that the Woggle Bug was gone. "Then," he replied, "you'd better give it to Bridget, for she's been bothering me about her wages lately, and the present will keep her quiet for a month longer." So she called Bridget and presented her with the dress, and the delighted servant decided to wear it that night to Mickey Schwartz's ball. Now the poor Woggle Bug, finding his affection scorned, was feeling very blue and unhappy that evening. When he walked out, dressed, among other things, in a purple striped shirt, with a yellow necktie and pea-green gloves, he looked a great deal more cheerful than he really was. He had put on another hat, for the Woggle Bug had a superstition that to change his hat was to change his luck, and luck seemed to have overlooked the fact that he was in existence. The hat may really have altered his fortunes, as the insect shortly met Ikey Swanson, who gave him a ticket to Mickey Schwartz's ball, for Ikey's clean dicky had not come home from the laundry, and so he could not go himself. The Woggle Bug, thinking to distract his mind from his dreams of love, attended the ball, and the first thing he saw as he entered the room was Bridget clothed in that same gorgeous gown of Wagnerian plaid that had so fascinated his bugly heart. The dear Bridget had added to her charm by putting 7 full-blown imitation roses and 3 second-hand ostrich plumes in her red hair, so that her entire person glowed like a sunset in June. The Woggle Bug was enraptured, and although the divine Bridget was waltzing with Fritzy Casey, the insect rushed to her side and, seizing her with all his 4 arms at once, cried out in his truly educated Bostonian way, "Oh, my superlative conglomeration of beauty, I have found you at last!" Bridget uttered a shriek, and Fritzy Casey doubled 2 fists that looked like tombstones, and advanced upon the intruder. Still embracing the plaid costume with 2 arms, the Woggle Bug tipped Mr. Casey over with the other 2. But Bridget made a bound, and landed with her broad heel, which supported 180 pounds, firmly upon the insect's toes. He gave a yelp of pain, and promptly released the lady, and a moment later he found himself flat upon the floor with a dozen of the dancers piled upon him, all of whom were pommeling each other with much pleasure and a firm conviction that the diversion had been planned for their special amusement. But the Woggle Bug had the strength of many men, and when he flopped the big wings that were concealed by the tails of his coat, the gentlemen resting upon him were scattered like autumn leaves in a gust of wind. The insect stood up, rearranged his dress, and looked about him. Bridget had run away and gone home, and the others were still fighting amongst themselves with exceeding cheerfulness. So the Woggle Bug selected a hat which fit him, his own having been crushed out of shape, and walked sorrowfully back to his lodgings. Evidently that was not a lucky hat I wore to the ball, he reflected, but perhaps this one I now have will bring about a change in my fortunes. Bridget needed money, and as she had worn her brilliant costume once and allowed her friends to see how becoming it was, she carried it the next morning to a second-hand dealer and sold it for $3 in cash. Scarcely had she left the shop when a lady of Swedish extraction, a widow with 4 small children in her train, entered and asked to look at a gown. The dealer showed her the one he had just bought from Bridget, and its gay coloring so pleased the widow that she immediately purchased it for $3.65. "I thinks it's a good deal money for sure," she says to herself, "but das leetle children must have new fader to make mind and take care of their mother like, by Yiminy, and I think no man look my way in das old dress I been wearing." She took the gown and the 4 children to her home, where she lost no time in trying on the costume, which fitted her as perfectly as a flour sack does a peck of potatoes. "Das beautiful!" she exclaimed in rapture, as she tried to see herself in a cracked mirror. "I go das very afternoon to walk in the park, for das man folks go crazy like when they see my fine frocks." Then she took her green parasol and a handbag stuffed with papers, to make it look prosperous and aristocratic, and sallied forth to the park, followed by all her interesting flock. The men didn't fail to look at her, as you may guess, but none looked with yearning until the Woggle-Bug, sauntering gloomily along a path, happened to raise his eyes and see before him his heart's delight the very identical Wagnerian plaids which had filled him with such unbounded affection. "Aha! My excruciatingly lovely creation!" he cried, running up and kneeling before the widow. "I have found you once again. Do not, I beg of you, treat me with coldness." For he had learned from experience not to unduly startle his charmer at their first moment of meeting, so he made a firm attempt to control himself, that the wearer of the checked gown might not scorn him. The widow had no great affection for bugs, having wrestled with the species for so many years, but this one was such a big bug, and so handsomely dressed that she saw no harm in encouraging him, especially as the men she had sought to captivate were proving exceedingly shy. "So you think I been lovely?" she asked, with a coy glance at the insect. "I do, with all my heart I do," protested the Woggle-Bug, placing all 4 hands, one after another, over that beating organ. "Das mak plenty trouble by you. I don't go be yours," sighed the widow, indeed regretting her admirer was not an ordinary man. "Why not?" asked the Woggle-Bug. "I have still the $7.93, and as that was the original price, and you are now slightly worn and second-handed, I do not see why I need despair of calling you my own." It is very queer, when we think of it, that the Woggle-Bug could not separate the wearer of his lovely gown from the gown itself. Indeed, he always made love directly to the costume that had so enchanted him, without any regard whatsoever to the person inside it. And the only way we can explain this remarkable fact is to recollect that the Woggle-Bug was only a Woggle-Bug, and nothing more could be expected of him. The widow did not, of course, understand his speech in the least, but she gathered the fact that the Woggle-Bug had money, so she sighed and hinted that she was very hungry, and that there was a good short-order restaurant just outside the park. The Woggle-Bug became thoughtful at this. He hated to squander his money, which he had come to regard a sort of purchase price with which to secure his divinity. But neither could he allow those darling checks to go hungry, so he said, "If you will come with me to the restaurant, I will gladly supply you with food." The widow accepted the invitation at once, and the Woggle-Bug walked proudly beside her, leading all of the 4 children at once with his 4 hands. 2 such gay costumes as those worn by the widow and the Woggle-Bug are seldom found together, and the restaurant man was so impressed by the sight that he demanded his money in advance. The 4 children, jabbering delightedly in their broken English, clambered upon 4 stools, and the widow sat upon another. And the Woggle-Bug, who was not hungry, being engaged in feasting his eyes upon the checks, laid down a silver dollar as a guarantee of good faith. It was wonderful to see so much pie and cake and bread and butter and pickles and doughnuts and sandwiches disappear into the mouths of the 4 innocents and their comparatively innocent mother. The Woggle-Bug had to add another quarter to the vanished dollar before the score was finally settled, and no sooner had the tribe trooped out of the restaurant than they turned into the open portals of an ice cream parlor, where they all attacked huge stacks of pale ice cream and consumed several plates of lady fingers and cream puffs. Again the Woggle-Bug reluctantly abandoned a dollar, but the end was not yet. The dear children wanted candy and nuts, and then they wanted pink lemonade, and then popcorn and chewing gum, and always the Woggle-Bug, after a glance at the entrancing costume, found himself unable to resist paying for the treat. It was nearly evening when the widow pleaded fatigue and asked to be taken home, for none of them was able to eat another morsel, and the Woggle-Bug wearied her with his protestations of boundless admiration. "Will you permit me to call upon you this evening?" asked the insect pleadingly as he bade the wearer of the gown good-bye on her doorstep. "Sure like," she replied, not caring to dismiss him harshly, and the happy Woggle-Bug went home with a light heart, murmuring to himself, "At last the lovely plaids are to be my own. The new hat I found at the ball has certainly brought me luck." I am glad that our friend the Woggle-Bug had those few happy moments, for he was destined to endure severe disappointments in the near future. That evening he carefully brushed his coat, put on a green satin necktie and a purple embroidered waistcoat, and walked briskly towards the house of the widow. But alas! As he drew near to the dwelling, a most horrible stench greeted his nostrils. A sense of great depression came over him, and upon pausing before the house his body began to tremble and his eyes rolled wildly in their sockets. For the wily widow, wishing to escape her admirer, had sprinkled the doorstep and the front walk with insect exterminator, and not even the Woggle-Bug's love for the enchanting checked gown could induce him to linger longer in that vicinity. Sick and discouraged, he returned home, where his first act was to smash the luckless hat and replace it with another. But it was some time before he recovered from the horrors of that near approach to extermination, and he passed a very wakeful and unhappy night indeed. Meantime the widow had traded with a friend of hers, who had once been a wash-lady for General Funston, the Wagnerian costume for a crazy quilt and a corset that was nearly as good as new, and a pair of silk stockings that were not mates. It was a good bargain for both of them, and the wash-lady being colored, that is, she had a deep mahogany complexion, was delighted with her gorgeous gown and put it on the very next morning when she went to deliver the wash to the bricklayer's wife. Surely it must have been fate that directed the Woggle-Bug's steps, for as he walked disconsolately along, an intuition caused him to raise his eyes, and he saw just ahead of him his affinity carrying a large clothes-basket. "Stop!" he called out anxiously. "Stop, my fair grenadine, I implore you." The colored lady cast one glance behind her and imagined that Satan had at last arrived to claim her, for she had never before seen the Woggle-Bug, and was horrified by his sudden and unusual appearance. "Go away, Mars Debbil, go away and leave me alone," she screeched, and the next minute she dropped her empty basket and sped up the street with a swiftness that only fear could have lent her flat-bottomed feet. Nevertheless, the Woggle-Bug might have overtaken her had he not stepped into the clothes-basket and fallen headlong, becoming so tangled up in the thing that he rolled over and over several times before he could free himself. Then, when he had picked up his hat, which was utterly ruined, and found his cane, which had flown across the street, his mahogany charmer in the Wagnerian plaids had disappeared from view. With a sigh at his latest misfortune, he returned home for another hat, and the agitated washlady, imagining that the devil had doubtless been lured by her beautiful gown, made haste to sell it to a Chinaman who lived next door. Its bright colors pleased the Chink, who ripped it up and made it over into a Chinese robe, with flowing draperies falling to his heels. He dressed himself in his new costume, and being proud of possessing such finery, sat down on a bench outside his door so that everyone passing by could see how magnificent he looked. It was here the wandering Woggle-Bug espied him, and, recognizing at once the pattern and colors of his infatuating idol, he ran up and sat beside the Chinaman, saying in agitated but educated tones, "Oh, my prismatic personification of gigantic gorgeousness! Again I have found you." "Sure thing," said the Chink with composure. "Be mine, only be mine," continued the enraptured Woggle-Bug. The Chinaman did not quite understand. $2 a day," he answered cautiously. "Oh, joy!" exclaimed the insect in delight. "I can then own you for a day and a half, for I have $3 left. May I feel your exquisite texture, my dearest fabric?" "No flappick, no feely. You too flesh. I'm man Chinaman," returned the Oriental calmly. "Never mind that. 'Tis your beautiful garment I love. Every check in that entrancing dress is a joy and a delight to my heart." While the Woggle-Bug thus raved, the Chinaman's wife, who was Mattie de Forest before she married him, heard the conversation, and decided this love affair had gone far enough. So she suddenly appeared with a broomstick, and with it began pounding the Woggle-Bug as fiercely as possible, and Mattie was no weakling, I assure you. The first blow knocked the insect's hat so far over his eyes that he was blinded, but, resolving not to be again cheated out of his darling, he grasped firmly hold of the Wagnerian plaids with all four hands, and tore a goodly portion of it from the frightened Celestial's body. Next moment he was dashing down the street, with the precious cloth tucked securely underneath an arm, and Mattie, being in slight dishabille, did not think best to follow him. The triumphant joy of the Woggle-Bug can well be imagined. No more need to chase the fleeting vision of his love, no more submit to countless disappointments in his efforts to approach the object of his affection. The gorgeous plaids were now his own, or a large part of them anyway, and upon reaching the quiet room wherein he lodged, he gloated long and happily over its vivid coloring and violent contrasts of its glowing hues. To the eyes of the Woggle-Bug nothing could be more beautiful, and he positively regretted the necessity of ever turning his gaze from this bewitching treasure. That he might never in the future be separated from the checks, he folded them, with many loving caresses, into compact form, and wrapped them in a sheet of stout paper tied with cotton cord that had a love knot at the end. Wherever he went, thereafter, he carried the parcel underneath his left upper arm, pressed as closely to his heart as possible, and this sense of possession was so delightful that our Woggle-Bug was happy as the day is long. In the evening his fortunes changed with cruel abruptness. He walked out to take the air, and noticing a crowd of people standing in an open space and surrounding a huge brown object, our Woggle-Bug stopped to learn what the excitement was about. Pushing his way through the crowd, and hugging his precious parcel, he soon reached the inner circle of spectators and found they had assembled to watch a balloon ascension. The professor who was to go up with the balloon had not yet arrived, but the balloon itself was fully inflated and tugging hard at the rope that held it, as if anxious to escape the blended breaths of the people that crowded around. Just below the balloon was a small basket, attached to the netting of the gas bag, and the Woggle Bug was bending over the edge of this to see what it contained, when a warning cry from the crowd caused him to pause and glance over his shoulder. Great horrors and crumpled creeps! Springing towards him, with a scowl on his face and a long knife with a zigzag blade in his uplifted hand, was that very Chinaman from whose body he had torn the Wagnerian plaids. The plundered Celestial was evidently vindictive and intended to push the wicked knife into the Woggle Bug's body. Our hero was a brave bug, as can easily be proved, but he did not wait for the knife to arrive at the broad of his back. Instead, he gave a yell, to show he was not afraid, and leaped nimbly into the basket of the balloon. The descending knife, missing its intended victim, fell upon the rope and severed it, and instantly the great balloon broke from the crowd and soared majestically towards the heavens. The Woggle Bug had escaped the Chinaman, but he didn't know whether to be glad or not, for the balloon was carrying him into the clouds, and he had no idea how to manage it or to make it descend to earth again. When he peered over the edge of the basket, he could hear the faint murmur of the crowd, and dimly see the enraged professor, who had come too late, pounding the Chinaman, while the Chinaman tried to dissect the professor with his knife. Then all was blotted out. Clouds rolled about him. Night fell. The man in the moon laughed at him. The stars winked at each other as if delighted at the Woggle Bug's plight, and a witch riding by on her broomstick yelled at him to keep on the right side of the road and not run her down. But the Woggle Bug, squatted in the bottom of the basket and hugging his precious parcel to his bosom, paid no attention to anything but his own thoughts. He had often ridden in the Gump, but never had he been so high as this, and the distance to the ground made him nervous. When morning came, he saw a strange country far beneath him, and longed to tread the earth again. Now all Woggle Bugs are born with wings, and our highly magnified one had a beautiful, broad pair of floppers concealed beneath ample coat-tails. But long ago he had learned that his wings were not strong enough to lift his big body from the ground, so he had never tried to fly with them. Here, however, was an occasion when he might put these wings to good use, for if he spread them in the air, and then leaped over the side of the basket, they would act in the same way a parachute does, and bear him gently to the ground. No sooner did this thought occur to him than he put it into practice. Disentangling his wings from his coat-tails, he spread them as wide as possible, and then jumped from the car of the balloon. Down, down the Woggle Bug sank, but so slowly that there was no danger in the flight. He began to see the earth again, lying beneath him like a sun-kissed panorama of mud and frog ponds and rocks and brushwood. There were few trees, yet it was our insect's fate to drop directly above what trees there were, so that presently he came kerplunk into a mess of tangled branches, and stuck there, with his legs dangling helplessly between two limbs, and his wings caught in the foliage at either side. Below was a group of Arab children, who at first started to run away, but, seeing that the queer creature which had dropped from the skies was caught fast in the tree, they stopped and began to throw stones and clubs at it. One of the missiles struck the tree limb at the right of the Woggle Bug and jarred him loose. The next instant he fluttered to the ground, where his first act was to fold up his wings and tuck them underneath his coat-tails again, and his next action was to assure himself that the beloved plaids were still safe. Then he looked for the Arab children, but they had scuttled away towards a group of tents. And now several men with dark skins and gay clothing came from the tents and ran towards the Woggle Bug. "Good morning," said our hero, removing his hat with a flourish and bowing politely. "Meblachiba!" shouted the biggest Arab, and at once two others wound coils of rope around the Woggle Bug and tied the ends in hard knots. His hat was knocked off and trampled into the mud by the sheik, who was the big Arab, and the precious parcel was seized and ruthlessly opened. "Very good," said the sheik, eyeing the plaids with pleasure. "My slaves shall make me a new waistcoat of this cloth." "Oh, no, no!" cried the agonized insect. "It is taken from a person who has had smallpox and yellow fever and toothache and mumps all at the same time. Do not, I beg you, risk your valuable life by wearing that cloth." "Bah!" said the sheik scornfully. "I have had all those diseases and many more. I am immune. But now," he continued, "allow me to bid you good-bye. I am sorry to be obliged to kill you, but such is our custom." This was bad news for the Woggle Bug, but he did not despair. "Are you not afraid to kill me?" he asked, as if surprised. "Why should I be afraid?" demanded the sheik. "Because it is well known that to kill a Woggle Bug brings bad luck to one." The sheik hesitated, for he was very superstitious. "Are you a Woggle Bug?" he asked. "I am," replied the insect proudly, "and I may as well tell you that the last person who killed one of my race had 3 unlucky days. The first his suspenders broke." The Arab shuddered. "The second day he smashed a looking-glass." The Arab moaned. "And the third day he was chewed up by a crocodile." Now the greatest aversion Arabs have is to be chewed by a crocodile, because these people usually roam over the sands of the desert, where to meet an amphibian is simply horrible. So at the Woggle Bug's speech they set up a howl of fear, and the sheik shouted, "Unbind him! Let not a hair of his head be injured!" At once the knots and the ropes were untied, and the Woggle Bug was free. All the Arabs united to show him deference and every respectful attention, and since his own hat had been destroyed, they wound about his head a picturesque turban of an exquisite soiled white color, having stripes of red and yellow in it. Then the Woggle Bug was escorted to the tents, where he suddenly remembered his precious plaids and asked that the cloth be restored to him. Thereupon the sheik got up and made a long speech, in which he described his grief at being obliged to refuse the request. At the end of that time one of the women came up to them with a lovely waistcoat which she had manufactured out of the Wagnerian plaids, and when the sheik saw it he immediately ordered all the tom-toms and kettle-drums in the camp destroyed, as they were no longer necessary. Then he put on the gorgeous vestment and turned a deaf ear to the Woggle Bug's agonized wails. But there were some scraps of cloth left, and to show that he was liberal and good-natured, the sheik ordered these manufactured into a handsome necktie, which he presented Woggle Bug in another long speech. Our hero, realizing a larger part of his darling was lost to him, decided to be content with a smaller share, so he put on the necktie and felt really proud of its brilliance and aggressive elegance. Then, bidding the Arabs farewell, he strode across the desert until he reached the borders of a more fertile and favored country. Indeed, he found before him a cool and enticing jungle, which at first seemed deserted. But while he stared about him, a sound fell upon his ear, and he saw approaching a young lady chimpanzee. She was evidently a personage of some importance, for her hair was neatly banged just over her eyes, and she wore a clean white pinafore with bows of pink ribbon at the shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Beetle," said she, with merry laughter. "Do not, I beg of you, call me a beetle," exclaimed our hero, rather peevishly, "for I am actually a Woggle Bug, and highly magnified at that." "What's in a name?" laughed the gay damsel. "Come, let me introduce you to our jungle, where strangers of good breeding are always welcome." "As for breeding," said the Woggle Bug, "my father, although of ordinary size, was a famous bug wizard in his day, and claim descent from the original protoplasm which constituted the nucleus of the present planetary satellite upon which we exist." "That's all right," returned Miss Chim. "Tell that to our king, and he'll decorate you with the medal of the Omnipotent Order of Honorous Orthographers. Are you ready to meander?" The Woggle Bug did not like the flippant tone in which the maiden spoke, but he at once followed her. Presently they came to a tall hedge surrounding the inner jungle, and without this hedge stood a patrol of brown bears who wore red soldier caps and carried gold-plated muskets in their hands. "We call this the barrier," said Miss Chim, pointing to the soldiers, "because they oblige all strangers to pause." "I should think it was a barricade," remarked the Woggle Bug. But when they approached the gateway, the officer in charge saluted respectfully to Miss Chim, and permitted her to escort the Woggle Bug into the sacred precincts of the inner jungle. Here his eyes were soon opened to their widest capacity in genuine astonishment. The jungle was as clean and as well regulated as any city of men the insect had ever visited. Just within the gate a sleek antelope was running a popcorn stand, and a little further on a screech owl stood upon a stump playing a violin, while across her breast was a sign reading, "I am blind at present." As they walked up the street, they came to a big gray monkey turning a hand organ, and attached to a cord was a little boy whom the monkey sent into the crowd of animals, standing by to gather up the pennies, pulling him back every now and then by means of the cord. "There's a curious animal for you," said Miss Chim, pointing to the boy. "Those horrid things they call men, whether black or white, seem to me the lowest of all created beasts." "I have seen them in a highly civilized state," replied the Woggle Bug, "but they're really further advanced than you might suppose." But Miss Chim gave a scornful laugh and pulled him away to where a hippopotamus sat under the shade of a big tree, mopping his brow with a red handkerchief, for the weather was somewhat sultry. Before the hip was a table covered with a blue cloth, and upon the cloth was embroidered the words, "Professor Hipmus, Fortune Teller." "Want your fortune told?" asked Miss Chim. "I don't mind," replied the Woggle Bug. "I'll read your hand," said the Professor, with a yawn that startled the insect. "To my notion, palmistry is the best means of finding out what nobody knows or cares to know." He took the upper right hand of the Woggle Bug, and after adjusting his spectacles, bent over it with an air of great wisdom. "You have been in love," announced the Professor, "but you got it in the neck." "True," murmured the astonished insect, putting up his left lower hand to feel of the beloved necktie. "You think you have won," continued the hip, "but there are others who have won, too. You have many heart-throbs before you during your future life. Afterward I see no heart-throbs whatever. 40 cents, please." "Isn't he just wonderful?" asked Miss Chim with enthusiasm. "He's the greatest fortune-teller in the jungle." "On account of his size, I suppose," returned the Woggle Bug as they walked on. Soon they came to the royal palace, which was a beautiful bower formed by vines upon which grew many brilliant-hued forest flowers. The entrance was guarded by a zebra, who barred admission until Miss Chim whispered the password in his ear. Then he permitted them to enter, and the chimpanzee immediately ushered the Woggle Bug into the presence of King Weasel. This monarch lay coiled upon a purple silk cushion, half asleep, and yet wakeful enough to be smoking a big cigar. Beside him crouched 2 prairie dogs who were combing his hair very carefully, while a red squirrel perched near his head and fanned him with her bushy tail. "Dear me, what have we here?" exclaimed the King of the Jungle in a querulous tone. Is it an overgrown pinch bug, or is it a kissing bug?" "I have honor to be a woggle bug, your majesty," replied our hero proudly. "Sav, cut out that majesty," snapped the king, with a scowl. "If you can find anything majestic about me, I'd like to know what it is." "Don't treat him with any respect," whispered Miss Chim to the insect, "or you'll get him riled. Sneer at him and slap his face if you get a chance." The Woggle-Bug took the hint. "Really," he told the king, "I have never seen a more despicable creature than you. The admirable perspicacity inherent in your tribe seems to have deteriorated in you to a hyperbolated insouciancy." Then he reached out his arms and slapped the king 4 times, twice on one side of his face and twice on the other. "Thanks, my dear June Bug," said the monarch. "I now recognize you to be a person of some importance." "Sire, I am a Woggle Bug, highly magnified and thoroughly educated. It is no exaggeration to say I am the greatest Woggle Bug on earth." "I fully believe it. So pray do not play any more foursomes on my jaw. I am sufficiently humiliated at this moment to recognize you as a Salamantharos, should you claim to be a member of that extinct race." Then 2 little weasels, a boy weasel and a girl weasel, came into the bower and threw their school books at the squirrel so cleverly that one hit the king upon the nose and smashed his cigar, and the other caught him fairly in the pit of his stomach. At first the monarch howled a bit, then he wiped the tears from his face and said, "Ah, what delightful children I have! What do you wish, my darlings?" "I want a cent for chewing gum," said the girl weasel. "Get it from the guinea pig. You have my assent. What does my dear boy want?" "Pop," went the weasel, "our billy goat has swallowed the hare you gave me to play with." "Dear me," sighed the king, "how often I find a hare in the butter! Whenever I rain, people carry umbrellas, and my son, although quite polished, indulges only in monkey shines. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown, but if one is scalped, the loss of the crown renders the head still more uneasy." "Couldn't they find a better king than you?" inquired the Woggle-Bug curiously, as the children left the bower. "Yes, but no worse," answered the weasel. "And here in the jungle honors are conferred only upon the unworthy. For if a truly great animal is honored, he gets a swelled head, and that renders him unbearable. They now regard the king of the jungle with contempt, and that makes all my subjects self-respecting." "There is wisdom in that," declared the Woggle-Bug approvingly. "A single glance at you makes me content with being so excellent a bug." "True, murmured the king, yawning. "But you tire me, good stranger. Miss Chim, will you kindly get the gasoline can? It's high time to eradicate this insect." "With pleasure," said Miss Chim, moving away with a smile. But the Woggle-Bug did not linger to be eradicated. With one wild bound he cleared the door of the palace and sprinted up the entrance of the jungle. The bear soldiers saw him running away, and took careful aim and fired. But the gold-plated muskets would not shoot straight, and now the Woggle-Bug was far distant, and still running with all his might. Nor did he pause until he had emerged from the forest and crossed the plains, and reached at last the city from whence he had escaped in the balloon. And, once again in his old lodgings, he looked at himself in the mirror and said, "After all, this necktie is my love, and my love is now mine forever. Why should I not be happy and content?" The End. P.S. A full account of the Woggle-Bug is given in Mr. Baum's delightful counter-story, The Marvelous Land of Oz, in which is also narrated the amazing adventures of the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, Jack Pumpkinhead, and the Animated Sawhorse.
Story 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Clarica. Wonderwings and Other Fairy Stories by Edith Howes. Story 1. Wonderwings. Poppy Pink sat up in bed and yawned. "Why is everybody getting up so early?" she asked. "Is it a holiday?" The older fairies were dressing themselves and brushing their long, fine hair. "Wonderwings is coming to see us," they said. "Jump up, little Poppy Pink." "Who is Wonderwings?" she asked. "You will see when you are dressed. Hurry, or you will miss her." "Oh dear, I am so sleepy," said Poppy Pink, and she yawned again. "I don't care about Wonderwings." She snuggled down into the bedclothes again and went to sleep. Presently she was awakened by the sound of the sweetest singing she had ever heard, and a flash of brilliant color went past her window pane of crystal, set in pearl. "That must be Wonderwings," she said. "Oh, I must see her. I hope I am not too late." She sprang from bed and dressed so hurriedly that I'm afraid her hair did not receive its due amount of brushing. Then she ran out into the garden. The older fairies stood all in a group, saying loudly, "I will go," and "I will go." And before them, scarcely touching the ground with the tip of her foot, stood poised a glorious fairy, taller than any other there. She was altogether beautiful, and her wings, as soon as Poppy Pink saw them, she knew why the visitor had been called Wonderwings, for they reached high above her head and almost to the ground, and they glowed with so many colors that it seemed as if 1,000,000 jewels had been hung upon them and had stuck, growing into 1,000,000 flashing stars that made 1,000,000 little rainbows with every sway and movement of her body. "How lovely! Oh, how lovely!" cried Poppy Pink. She crept nearer to the beautiful fairy and sat among the daisies at her feet. "See," she cried, "my wings are small and colorless. Tell me how I may grow wings like yours. Just as little girls adore beautiful hair, so do little fairies adore beautiful wings." Wonderwings smiled down at her. "Such wings as mine are only to be won in sadder lands than these," she said. "If you would have them, you must leave your fairyland and come where humans live, and where hunger and sorrow and death trample the city streets." "I will come," cried Poppy Pink. "I will come." "Come then," said Wonderwings. She took the little fairy's hand, and up they all rose into the clear air, flying far and far away till they left their fairyland behind and came at last to the sadder lands where humans lived. There Wonderwings showed them where hunger and sorrow and death trampled the city streets, and the bands of fairies flew lower and lower to look. "The children tumble and fight in the dirty lanes and cry for bread," cried Poppy Pink. "The little ones, I cannot bear to hear them sob." "Perhaps you can help them," said Wonderwings. "I'm only a little fairy. What can I do?" asked Poppy Pink. "I have no bread to give them." She flew a little lower to gaze at them more nearly. "What can I do?" she asked again. No answer came. She looked around and found herself alone. Wonderwings and the older fairies had in a moment gone from sight. Below, a crippled child sat among some rags in a dark corner of a dreary room, and tears ran down her cheeks. "The sunshine, the pretty yellow sunshine!" she wailed. "If only I could run and play in the pretty sunshine!" "Here is something I can do," thought Poppy Pink. She gathered armfuls of the golden sunbeams, and flying with them through the glass as only a fairy can fly, herself unseen, she heaped them over the twisted hands and pale thin face of the child, and left her playing with them and smiling happily. Lower she flew, to help the little ones who cried about the gutters. She led the starving and shelterless to comfort, the toddlers to safety. She brought a flower to the hopeless, ease to sick ones racked with pain. At night she flew with glittering dreams from room to room, so that even sad-eyed feeble babies laughed for pleasure in their sleep. Day after day, night after night she toiled, for weeks and months and years. There was so much to do. The time passed like a moment. So busy was she that she had forgotten all about her wings. One day there came a flash of color in the air beside her, and Wonderwings and all the older fairies stood around her. "Dear Poppypink," cried one, "how your wings have grown, and how beautiful they are! They are so tall that they reach above your head and almost to the ground, and they glow with so many colors that it seems as if a million jewels had been flung upon them and had stuck, growing into a million flashing stars that make a million little rainbows with every sway and movement of your body." Poppypink laughed with joy. "I am so glad, so very glad," she said. "I had forgotten all about my wings." "Yet they have grown with use," said Wonderwings, "and for every deed of kindness done a star has sprung to shine in beauty there for evermore." End of Wonderwings.